Hannah Carter drove the last nail into her husband's coffin with her own hands because there was no one left willing to do it for her. She didn't cry. Not in front of them. Not in front of the men who were already measuring her land with their eyes before the dirt had even settled over Thomas's grave. She stood straight, shoulders squared, jaw tight, and she looked out at 43 acres of cracked clay and broken fence posts, and she made herself a promise so quiet that only God and the cold Montana wind could hear it. She was not going to lose this land. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning after Thomas Carter's funeral, Hannah woke before sunrise and did what she had always done when the world felt like it was collapsing. She worked. She pulled on her boots. She walked the fence line in the dark, running her fingers along the rotting posts, counting the gaps where cattle could have walked through if there had been any cattle left to wander. She checked the water trough, which held maybe 3 inches of standing water thick with algae. She stood at the barn door and looked inside at 4 empty stalls and the ghost of a life that had taken everything from her and left her with almost nothing in return. Thomas had been sick for 8 months before he died. 8 months of doctor bills and borrowed money and neighbors who meant well, but whose sympathy had a way of evaporating when the sun went down and their own families needed feeding. 8 months of Hannah grinding through every resource they had built together over 6 years of hard marriage on hard land. And when it was finally over, when Thomas took his last breath on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with Hannah holding his hand and Noah sitting on the floor in the corner because there was nowhere else for the boy to go. When it was finally, mercifully over, Hannah had discovered that what remained of their life together was 43 acres of cracked clay soil, a barn that needed a new roof, $312 in unpaid debts to the Redstone Valley Merchants Bank, and exactly $33.40 hidden in the coffee tin above the stove. $33.40. That was what 6 years of marriage and 20 years of Thomas Carter's hard labor had left behind. She didn't tell anyone about the tin. Not yet. She pulled herself back inside before the neighbors started arriving with their covered dishes and their careful eyes, and she sat at the kitchen table in the gray morning light, and she wrote every debt in her best handwriting in the small leather journal she kept for household accounts. She wrote the numbers slowly and deliberately because she needed to see them clearly. She needed to understand exactly what she was facing before she could decide what to do about it. The debt to the bank was the most urgent. Nathan Holt, the bank manager, had already sent a letter, received 2 days before Thomas died, shoved under a stack of papers so Thomas wouldn't see it and worry himself further into the grave, informing her that the mortgage payment was 60 days past due and that the bank would be initiating proceedings if arrangements were not made within 30 days of the letter's receipt. 30 days. She had 30 days. She set the journal down and pressed both hands flat against the table and breathed. Mrs. Carter. She looked up. Noah was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, still wearing the clothes he'd slept in, his dark hair sticking up on one side, his expression carefully arranged into something older than 12 years old had any right to look. He'd been living with them for 2 years, Thomas's second cousin's boy, orphaned when his parents were killed in a wagon accident crossing the pass. And in those 2 years, he had developed a talent for reading the temperature of a room that Hannah found both heartbreaking and useful. "You need breakfast," she said. "I can make it." "I know you can. Sit down and let me do it." He sat. She stood and went to the stove because she needed something to do with her hands, and because feeding the boy was the one thing that morning that felt completely uncomplicated. "What are we going to do?" he asked, while she was cracking eggs into the iron skillet. "I'm still working that out. I heard Mr. Dalton talking to Reverend Pierce yesterday, after the service." Noah paused. "He said you'd have to sell." Hannah kept her eyes on the eggs. "Mr. Dalton says a great many things. He said Victor Hale had already been asking around about the property, said Hale would give you a fair price." Another pause. "He said it like he thought a fair price was something you should be grateful for." The name Victor Hale landed in Hannah's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had known the name for years. Everyone in Redstone Valley knew the name. Victor Hale had come into the valley 6 years ago from somewhere back east, armed with money and a law firm, and a particular kind of smooth confidence that men without conscience often wore like a good coat. In 6 years, he had acquired 4 ranches, 2 parcels of grazing land, and the water rights to Copper Creek, and every single acquisition had followed the same basic pattern: a family in trouble, a low offer, and enough legal pressure applied at the right moment to make the low offer look like salvation. Thomas had hated him. Thomas had hated him so specifically and so completely that he'd refused to shake the man's hand at the Harvest Social 3 years running, which in Redstone Valley was about as close to a declaration of war as polite society allowed. Hannah set a plate in front of Noah and sat down across from him with her coffee. "Victor Hale," she said, "is not going to get this land." Noah looked at her over his eggs. "How?" "I don't know yet, but he isn't." She meant it. She meant it the way Thomas had meant things when he was at his most stubborn and his most certain, and she recognized the feeling because she had watched it in him often enough to know what it looked like from the inside. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous. A decision made so completely that arguing against it felt like arguing against gravity. The question was what exactly she was going to do. For 3 days she thought and calculated and walked the fence line in the dark and sat at the kitchen table with her journal open and her pencil moving across the numbers, looking for any combination that would hold. She could sell off part of the land, but any land sale took time, and the parcels worth anything were the ones she'd need to keep if she was going to run any kind of operation. She could take in laundry, or baking, or sewing, and she fully intended to, but the numbers from those calculations were brutal. Even working herself to the bone 7 days a week, she couldn't generate enough income to service the debt and keep the property alive within 30 days. She needed something else. On the 4th morning, she rode into town to buy flour and coffee and whatever else the $33 would stretch to cover, and that was when she saw the notice. It was posted on the board outside the Mercantile, printed on cheap paper in large block letters, the way government notices always were. Government Livestock Auction, Redstone Valley Holding Yard. 80 head mixed breed. Cavalry surplus, working stock, wild Mustang. Condemned for disposal. Minimum bid $25 entire lot. Auction this Saturday. Unsold animals will be destroyed Monday morning. She read it twice. Then she rode to the holding yard. The yard was on the eastern edge of town, behind the old freight depot, and she smelled it before she saw it. That particular combination of horse and hay, and something underneath that, something close to despair, if despair had a smell. She tied her horse at the gate and walked through and stopped. There were 80 of them. They were black, all of them, or close enough to all of them that the few browns and bays barely registered. Black horses of every size and age, from a couple of old cavalry horses who stood with the patience of animals that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, to young Mustangs who still had enough fire left to pace the fence line and show their teeth, to a group of workhorses in the middle who stood with their heads low and their ribs visible beneath their coats, and their eyes holding that particular expression that horses get when they have decided that hope is an indulgence they can no longer afford. They were thin. They were scarred. Some of them had saddle sores that hadn't healed properly. One of the Mustangs had a long gash along his shoulder that had been treated badly or not at all. The old cavalry horses had the marks of hard campaigns on them. Not just physical marks, but something in the way they carried themselves. A bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond hunger. Hannah walked the length of the yard slowly. A government man in a dusty coat watched her from the office doorway with the expression of someone who has given up expecting anything interesting to happen. "They're scheduled for destruction Monday," she said, without turning around. "Yes, ma'am. Saturday's the last chance. $25 takes the lot. Every single one." "Yes, ma'am. We don't split the herd." She turned around. "Why not?" He shrugged. "Because nobody wants any of them individually. They're old or wild or half dead. A few of them might be worth something with work, but you'd have to know which ones, and nobody's bothered to find out. $25 for the lot, or they go down Monday." Hannah looked back at the horses. There was one, an old stallion standing slightly apart from the rest, not pacing, not despairing, just watching her with dark, steady eyes. He had a white scar running diagonally across his forehead, old enough to have healed smooth, and he held himself with a kind of quiet authority that made him look like he had been the leader of something once and hadn't entirely forgotten it. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. "I'll take them," she said. The government man stared at her. "Ma'am, that's 80 horses. I understand basic arithmetic. You got somewhere to put 80 horses? I have 43 acres. He blinked. Ma'am, that's not a lot of land for 80 horses. Then I'd better get started on finding them more to eat. She turned back to face him fully. I have $25. Do we have a deal or not? She did not have $25. She had $33.40 and $312 in debt, and $25 was most of what stood between her and complete destitution. But she looked the government man in the eye and said it like she meant it because she did mean it, and because the alternative was walking back out through that gate and going home and waiting for Victor Hale to show up on her porch with his smooth voice and his low offer and his patience, and she would rather spend her last dollar on 80 dying horses than give that man the satisfaction. "Deal," the government man said, still looking at her like she had lost her mind. "Saturday morning, bring your money." She nodded and walked back out to her horse and rode home and sat at the kitchen table and opened her journal and did the arithmetic one more time, just to be certain she understood what she had just agreed to. $25 for the horses. That left $8.40. $8.40 to feed herself and Noah, and 80 horses through a Montana winter. She closed the journal. "All right," she said quietly, to no one but herself and the cold kitchen and the October wind coming through the gap under the door that Thomas had been meaning to fix since last February. All right then. She rode back into town the next morning, and she borrowed $8 from Margaret Ellis, the elderly widow who lived 3 miles east and who had been Thomas's mother's closest friend, and who was, in Hannah's experience, the only person in Redstone Valley who gave money without attaching stories to it. Margaret handed over the $8 from a blue jar on her kitchen shelf and said only, "What are you going to do with it?" "Buy horses," Hannah said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thomas always said you were the steadiest person he'd ever known." Thomas said a great many things. He was right about that one. Hannah took the $8 and rode home. The auction was on a Saturday. She brought $33. The 25 from the coffee tin, and the 8 from Margaret's blue jar, and she stood at the gate of the holding yard in the pale October morning light, and she counted the money into the government man's hand, and received in exchange a single sheet of paper stating that 80 horses of mixed breed were now the legal property of Hannah Marie Carter of Redstone Valley, Montana. She stood there holding that piece of paper while the government man went to open the gate, and she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of raw terror. 10 seconds of standing in the cold morning and understanding completely that she had just spent everything she had on 80 animals that most of the county would have let die without losing sleep over it. And then she folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket and squared her shoulders and waited. They weren't alone that morning, unfortunately. Word had gotten around. In Redstone Valley, word always got around. And there was a small audience assembled at the fence. Frank Dalton was there, leaning on the post with his arms crossed and his expression set to satisfied. Amos Reed from the feed store stood nearby, already calculating, Hannah suspected, how little hay she could possibly afford to buy and how quickly the horses would die as a result. There were 2 women from the church auxiliary whose names Hannah could never remember, and they stood together and whispered to each other with their hands covering their mouths, in the way that women whispered when they wanted you to know they were talking about you. And there, at the far end of the fence, standing slightly apart from everyone else, with his hat tipped forward and a proprietary kind of stillness about him, was Victor Hale. He wasn't watching the horses. He was watching her. Hannah looked at him directly for exactly 1 second, long enough to make certain he knew she saw him, and then she looked away. The gate opened. The black horses poured through in a loose, uncertain stream. Some willing, some reluctant, some wild-eyed with a fear that had nowhere to go. And Hannah stood at the edge of the road and watched them come, and felt something settle in her chest that she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't quite hope. It was something more fundamental than either of those things. Something that felt less like an emotion and more like a decision that had already been made and was simply waiting for her body to catch up to it. Noah appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him ride up, but he was there. He had a gift for appearing at the right moment that she had long since stopped being surprised by. "That's a lot of horses," he said. "Yes. We don't have enough hay." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, watching the herd move past. Then, in a voice that had made its own kind of quiet decision, "I can sleep in the barn. I'll keep watch at night." Hannah looked at him sideways. He was 12 years old and thin for his age, and his boots were a size too big, and he was looking at 80 starving black horses with the expression of someone who has just claimed a cause. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I want to." She looked back at the horses. "Then that's what you'll do." The crowd at the fence watched in silence as the herd moved through. Hannah heard Frank Dahl say something to Amos Reed. She caught the word fool and let it pass through her like wind through a fence. She heard the church women's whispering intensify and subside. She heard, from somewhere, a short, low laugh that she chose not to look for the source of. She kept her eyes on the herd. The old stallion with the scar came through last. He walked at his own pace, unhurried, and when he came even with Hannah, he stopped, actually stopped, right there in the road, and turned his head and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had watched her in the holding yard, and decided something about her that he hadn't communicated to anyone else. Hannah looked back at him. "All right," she said quietly. "We're going home." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked after the herd. Noah made a small sound beside her that might have been awe. The walk back to the ranch took most of the morning. Hannah and Noah moved the herd slowly, letting the animals find their own pace, and there were a dozen small crises along the way. A young Mustang who bolted into a stand of brush and had to be coaxed back out. 3 horses who stopped at the creek and refused to cross until the old stallion walked over first. An old cavalry horse who simply lay down in the road for 20 minutes and had to be waited out with patience neither Hannah nor Noah entirely felt. By the time they got the herd through the gate and onto the ranch, the sun was high, and Hannah was more exhausted than she had allowed herself to feel in weeks. She latched the gate and leaned against it for a moment with her eyes closed, listening to the sounds of 80 horses spreading out across her land. The soft percussion of hooves on cracked clay, the occasional snort or whinny, the rustling of animals who had been confined for too long beginning, very tentatively, to move. When she opened her eyes, Victor Hale was sitting on a horse at the end of her drive. He was wearing a good coat and a clean hat and the particular expression of a man who is very certain of how a situation is going to end and finds the performance of watching it unfold mildly entertaining. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was the kind of pleasant that had nothing friendly in it. "Mr. Hale, that's quite a purchase." He looked past her at the horses moving across the property. 80 animals on 43 acres. Impressive ambition. "Thank you." "I meant it as an observation, not a compliment." He shifted in the saddle, easy and unhurried. "I want to reiterate my offer on the property. I think you'll find it more than fair given the circumstances." "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard the number." "It doesn't matter." He looked at her with those calculating eyes. The eyes of a man who spent his professional life determining the exact amount of pressure required to move an obstacle. And he smiled. It was a perfectly calibrated smile. Warm enough to seem reasonable. Cold enough to be a warning. "Winter's coming, Mrs. Carter. Feed prices are only going to rise. Those animals are already malnourished. Any competent livestock man would tell you half of them won't make spring." He paused. "I'll revisit my offer in December. I suspect the number will look different to you by then." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I appreciate you coming all the way out here. But I think we both know this conversation isn't going to end the way you've planned it. You might as well ride home." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. He was too controlled for anger. Something more deliberate. Something that filed the moment away for later use. "Good day, Mrs. Carter," he said pleasantly. He turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Hannah watched him go. Noah came to stand beside her. "He's going to come back," the boy said. "Yes," Hannah agreed. "He is." "What are we going to do?" Hannah was quiet for a moment, watching Victor Hale's back growing smaller in the distance. Then she turned and looked at the horses. 80 black horses spreading across her cracked clay land, thin and scarred and marked for death until she'd decided they weren't, grazing on ground that barely had enough growth to sustain a handful of cattle, never mind a herd of this size. She looked at them the way she had been looking at impossible things for the past week, steadily, without flinching, trying to find inside the impossibility some angle she hadn't yet considered. "We're going to figure it out," she said. Noah looked at her. "That's not much of a plan." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's the one we've got." From somewhere in the middle of the herd, the old stallion lifted his head and looked east. Hannah noticed. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she noticed. The first thing she did the next morning was ride into town and speak to Nathan Holt at the bank. She wore her best dress, and she carried her payment journal, and she sat across from him in his small, warm office, and she looked him directly in the eye, and she told him the truth. Not all of it, not the part about the horses, because she already knew what his face would do when she told him about the horses, and she needed him listening before she got to that part. But the financial truth, the amount of the debt, the timeline, and the fact that she intended to meet every penny of it. "Mrs. Carter," Nathan Holt said carefully, "the bank's position hasn't changed." "I understand that. I'm telling you mine has. I am not selling this property. I am going to find a way to make it productive, and I am going to service this debt, and I would appreciate 30 additional days while I put the first pieces in place." He looked at her with the expression of a man who was not unsympathetic and was trying to determine how much sympathy he could afford. 30 days. That takes us to the end of November. "Yes. That's a very short runway, Mrs. Carter." "I'm aware of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's your plan?" She had been waiting for the question. "I've acquired livestock," she said. "I intend to establish a breeding operation. The horses I've purchased are mixed stock. There's quality in that herd once they're healthy. A good breeding operation takes time to turn a profit, but the potential is substantial." Every word of it was true. She just hadn't mentioned how many horses, or what condition they were in, or where they'd come from. Holt looked at her papers. He looked at her face. He looked at the papers again. 30 days, he said finally. "I'll note it in the file. But Mrs. Carter, I need to see some evidence of forward progress when you come back. I can't simply keep extending indefinitely." "You won't need to. 30 days. She rode home feeling something that was not quite confidence and not quite relief, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. The feeling of having bought a small amount of time with nothing but her own word and her ability to look a man in the eye and sound like she believed what she was saying. Which she did believe. Mostly. The question was what exactly she was going to do with 30 days. Back at the ranch, Noah had been busy. He had repaired 3 sections of fence that were on the verge of failure, hauled water from the creek twice, and distributed what little hay they had across 3 rough piles that the horses had descended on with an urgency that was difficult to watch. He was in the barn when she rode in, his face flushed with work, and he looked up at her with the expression he used when he was trying to determine how the news was before deciding what his own face should do. 30 more days, she said, before he could ask. He breathed out. "Okay. It's not a lot." "No, ma'am." She dismounted and began unsaddling her horse. "Have you eaten?" "Not since this morning." "Go inside and eat something." "The bay mare near the east fence. She's been limping. I think her left fore has something in it." Hannah paused. "Show me before you go in." He showed her. The mare had a stone wedged into her hoof. Not deep, not infected yet, but on its way to being a problem. Hannah worked it out with her pick knife, while Noah held the horse steady and talked to her in a low, even voice that the mare seemed to find genuinely comforting. When it was done, and the mare had been walked briefly to confirm she was moving better, Noah looked at Hannah with the particular expression that meant he had something to say that he'd been carrying for a while. "The old stallion," he said. "The one with the scar." "What about him?" "He keeps going the east side of the property. Not just wandering. Going. Like he knows where he's headed. He was out there again this morning, and a bunch of the others were following him." Hannah had seen it herself, in the corner of her awareness, without having yet decided what to do with the observation. "Animals move toward water," she said. "There's no water on the east side." "No," she agreed. "There isn't." They looked at each other. "You think there might be?" Noah asked. Hannah thought of something Margaret Ellis had said to her, years ago, about her late husband, who had spent his life studying the land. Margaret's husband had believed, with the deep conviction of a man who had walked every inch of the valley, that the eastern basin sat on top of something ancient, something buried and forgotten, and waiting for someone with the patience to listen for it. She had thought of it as an old man's fancy. The kind of story that grew up around people who spent too much time alone with the land and not enough time with other people. Now she thought about 80 black horses, moving east every morning before sunrise. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think we ought to find out." Noah's eyes lit up with the particular brightness that 12-year-olds get when something impossible starts to feel possible. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, first light." She turned back toward the house. "Go eat your supper." He went. Hannah stood for a moment in the cooling evening air and looked east, toward the part of her property that was all rock and hard clay and cracked earth and absolutely nothing else, toward the direction that 80 starving horses kept walking every morning, with a certainty that looked, if you watched it long enough and let yourself consider it honestly, like something more than instinct. It looked like knowing. She didn't let herself think that word too clearly yet. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman, and practical women did not build their survival strategies on what horses seemed to know. But she turned it over in her mind as she went inside and made supper, and sat across the table from Noah while he ate, and talked about the horses with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had just found a reason to care about getting up in the morning. And she thought about the old stallion's dark, steady eyes looking east. And she thought about 43 acres of cracked clay that everyone in the valley had already given up on. And she thought about Victor Hale sitting on his horse at the end of her drive with his calibrated smile. She thought about all of those things, and she made a decision. In the morning, she was going to follow the horses. The fire in the stove had burned low by the time she finally allowed herself to sit with her coffee and her journal and let the exhaustion of the past 2 weeks settle into her bones for a moment. Noah had long since gone to his bedroll in the barn. He had insisted, and she had let him, because the horses needed watching and because he needed to feel useful, and both of those things were true and not in conflict. The ranch was quiet around her. Outside, she could hear the occasional movement of the herd, the soft sounds of 80 animals settling into uneasy sleep on unfamiliar ground, and underneath that, the sound of wind moving across clay flats in the dark. She opened her journal and looked at the numbers again. They hadn't changed. They still said the same thing they had been saying for 2 weeks, that the runway was short, the resources were gone, and the margin for error was essentially zero. She closed the journal. She looked at the window, at the dark outside it, at the direction that was east. "All right, Thomas," she said quietly, to the empty kitchen and the memory of a man who had never once in their marriage backed down from anything, not even at the end. "I don't know if you can hear this from wherever you are, but I bought 80 horses today, and everyone in this county thinks I've gone out of my mind, and I need this to work, and I'm asking you to be useful if you can figure out how." The fire popped. The wind shifted. Outside, very distantly, she heard the old stallion move, heard the sound of his hooves on the cracked earth, deliberate and certain, heading east. She sat with her coffee and listened to the sound of him walking toward something none of them could see yet, and she let herself, just for a moment, believe that the walking meant something. Then she stood up, banked the fire, and went to bed. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. She was up before the horses. That was saying something, because the old stallion with the scar had been moving since before first light. She could hear him from inside the house, that deliberate percussion of hooves on cracked clay, steady and unhurried, the same direction it had been every morning since they arrived. East. Always east. Hannah had lain in her bed for exactly 4 minutes, listening to the sound of him, and then she had gotten up, pulled on her boots, wrapped herself in Thomas's old work coat that still hung on the peg by the door, and gone out into the dark to follow him. Noah was already in the yard. Of course he was. He was standing just outside the barn door with his own coat buttoned wrong, in the way he always buttoned it when he dressed in a hurry, holding a lantern in one hand and watching the herd with the focused attention of someone who had been watching for a while and had already noticed something worth noticing. "He's been going since before I woke up," Noah said, without turning around. "And look, more of them are following him this morning than yesterday." Hannah looked. He was right. Yesterday it had been the stallion, and perhaps a dozen of the others drifting behind him in a loose, uncertain cluster. This morning it was closer to 30. A third of the herd moving in a quiet, purposeful stream toward the eastern edge of the property, following the scarred stallion with a collective certainty that had no anxiety in it. Not the nervous movement of animals searching for food or water they couldn't find. Something more organized than that, more deliberate. "Leave the lantern," Hannah said. "Bring the shovel from the barn." He looked at her. "You think we should dig?" "I think we should follow first, then decide." They went east. The property's eastern boundary was the part of the ranch that Thomas had always called the dead end. 40 acres of hard clay and exposed rock ledge, the kind of ground that made experienced farmers look at it once and look away because there was nothing in it that invited optimism. No grass worth mentioning. No trees. The soil where it existed at all was pale and thin and packed so hard that a shovel bounced off it if you weren't careful. Thomas had run a few cattle up here in the first year and given it up by the second because the animals lost weight standing on it, and there wasn't a thing he could do to change that. Hannah had never spent much time up here. There had never been a reason. But the stallion was here, standing in the gray pre-dawn light on a flat stretch of rocky ground about 30 yards from the eastern fence line, surrounded by a loose ring of other horses who stood with their heads down and their nostrils working the air. And he wasn't moving. He was standing in one specific spot with a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a tired animal. It was the stillness of an animal that has arrived somewhere. Hannah stopped 10 feet away from him. The stallion turned his head and looked at her with those dark, measuring eyes, and she had the unsettling and entirely irrational feeling that he had been waiting for her to catch up. "Right here?" Noah asked, standing beside her with the shovel. "He keeps stopping in the same spot?" "Every morning. I measured it yesterday with my steps from the fence. Same spot every time." Hannah looked at the ground. It looked like every other inch of the eastern flats. Pale, hard, dead. A person looking at it would see nothing. She thought about what Margaret Ellis had said about her late husband. She thought about the word he had used, aquifer. She thought about water moving underground through stone, finding its own way through solid rock over centuries, pooling in places that had nothing on the surface to announce it. She thought about 80 horses who had been starved nearly to nothing, and somehow still had enough conviction to walk 30 yards east every single morning and stand in exactly the same spot. "Start digging," she said. Noah drove the shovel into the ground with both hands. The first strike bounced off hard clay with a shock that rattled up the handle and through his arms, and he winced and tried again, and gradually, with the patience of a boy who had grown up understanding that most things worth doing were harder than they looked, he began to work through the surface crust. Hannah knelt beside him and used her hands to clear away the loosened dirt. The clay was cold and dry for the first 6 inches, which told her nothing she didn't already know. Then it changed. She felt it before she could see it. A shift in temperature, subtle enough that she thought at first she was imagining it. The clay going from cold to something colder, the way the air changes when you walk through a door into a room where a window has been left open. She pressed her fingers deeper into the loosened soil and held still. "Noah, stop." He stopped. She pressed both hands flat against the bottom of the shallow hole they'd made, and she held her breath, and she felt it. Faint, unmistakable, the particular coolness of earth that has water moving beneath it. "Keep going," she said. Slower. He went slower. She cleared with her hands, inch by inch, and the soil kept changing. Darker now, the color deepening from pale clay to something richer and faintly damp. And then, at about 14 inches down, Noah's shovel struck something and made a sound that neither of them had been expecting. Not the dull thud of hitting rock. A hollow sound. A resonant sound. The sound of a shovel striking the surface of something that had space beneath it. They both went still. The stallion, standing 10 feet away, lifted his head and looked at them. Not startled. More like a teacher who has been watching students work a problem and has just seen them arrive at the right answer. "What was that?" Noah whispered. "Noah." Hannah reached into the hole with both hands and pressed her palms against the flat stone surface that the shovel had found. It was cold. Genuinely, deeply cold, the way stone gets when it's sitting directly above moving water. And when she pressed hard enough, when she applied real pressure with both hands, she felt, impossibly, unmistakably, a slight give. A trembling, almost, like a membrane under strain. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together in her lap to stop it. "Go get Margaret Ellis," she said. Noah stared at her. "Mrs. Ellis? Now? It's barely sunrise." "I know what time it is. Go get her. Tell her Hannah Carter needs her to come look at something on the east side of the ranch and that it's important. She'll come." He hesitated one more second, reading her face for the information her voice wasn't giving, and whatever he found there made him set down the shovel without another word and go. Hannah stayed where she was, kneeling in the cold dirt, her hands pressed against a flat stone that was trembling with the weight of something ancient pushing against it from below. The stallion stood beside her. He didn't move. Neither did she. Margaret Ellis arrived 40 minutes later, driving her old buckboard at a pace that suggested Noah had communicated the urgency effectively. She was 71 years old, small and dry as winter grass, and she wore the expression she always wore, a carefully arranged blankness that could mean almost anything, and usually meant she was thinking harder than anyone in the room. She climbed down from the buckboard without help and walked across the rocky flats to where Hannah was kneeling, and she looked at the shallow excavation, and she looked at the ring of horses standing nearby, and she looked at the stallion. Then she got down on one knee, which Hannah could tell cost her something, and she pressed her own hand against the stone. For a long moment, she was perfectly still. Then she said, very quietly, "Good Lord." "Tell me what your husband said about the Eastern Basin," Hannah said. "He said it was sitting on top of an old aquifer, pre-glacial, older than anything in this valley. He spent 20 years trying to find where the pressure was high enough to access it." Margaret pressed harder against the stone. "He said the animals would know before the people did. He tried to follow the cattle once. His friends laughed at him." "Did he ever find it?" "No. He died still looking." She stood slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned to be precise about what her body could manage. She looked at Hannah steadily. "You understand what this means?" "I have some idea." "No," Margaret said, and her voice had taken on the particular quality it got when she wanted to make certain something was heard. "I don't think you have a full idea yet. This valley has been drought dry for 3 years. There are 7 families in this county who are on the edge of losing everything because there isn't enough water to run their operations. My husband believed the Eastern Basin aquifer, if it could be accessed, had enough pressure to run a well that would change the water situation for the entire valley, not just your land, the whole valley. The whole valley." Hannah sat with those words for a moment. "If we can breach the stone," she said. "If you can breach the stone, and if what's below it is what Edward believed it was, and if—" Margaret stopped. Her eyes sharpened. "Does Victor Hale know you're digging up here?" The name landed in the cold morning air like a rock in still water. "No," Hannah said. "No one knows. Not yet." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, And in that look was the communication of someone who had lived in Redstone Valley long enough to understand exactly what no one knows yet meant when it was attached to a piece of information that Victor Hale would find valuable. "Then you need to move quickly," Margaret said, "and you need to be very careful who you tell." They worked that day and the next and the day after that. Hannah sold Thomas's pocket watch, the good one, his father's, the one she'd been saving because she couldn't bear to let it go, and got $14 for it at the trading post. And with that money, she bought 2 better shovels and a pickaxe, and 3 days of Noah's full labor and her own. They worked in shifts, Hannah and Noah, digging down along the stone shelf in the cold early morning hours when the air was thin and honest, and the horses stood around them in their loose ring, watching with the patient attention of animals who understood perfectly what was happening and had been waiting for the humans to figure it out. On the morning of the 4th day, 18 inches below the surface of the cracked clay of Hannah Carter's dead East Acres, a crack appeared in the stone. Not dramatic. Not the way it happened in the stories people told later, when the story had been improved by repetition until it was more legend than truth. It was a thin, fine line, barely visible, running along the natural grain of the rock, and from that line came a smell. Clean, cold, mineral sharp. That was the smell of water that had been moving through stone for longer than anyone alive could calculate. Noah smelled it first. He was on his hands and knees clearing loose material from around the crack when he stopped moving and looked up at Hannah with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the careful composure of a boy who had learned too young to manage his hopes, but something wide open, something that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be joy or disbelief. "Do you smell that?" he said. Hannah was already moving toward him. She got down beside him, and she put her face close to the crack in the stone, and she breathed in, and what came back to her was the cleanest, coldest thing she had smelled in months. Sharp with mineral and deep with the particular freshness of water that has traveled a long way through the dark before finding the light. "Yes," she said. "What do we do?" She sat back. Her pulse was doing something complicated. She made herself breathe through it, made herself think, because what she did in the next few moments mattered more than almost any decision she had made in the past 2 weeks, and she needed her head clear. "We go get Mr. Keene," she said. Henry Keene was the county land surveyor, a quiet, methodical man who drank too much in the evenings, but who was, in the daylight hours, the most precise and reliable professional in Redstone Valley. He was the only person in the county who could properly assess what they had found and document it in a way that would be legally and professionally defensible, which mattered. Because the moment this became known, and it would become known, that was not a question of if, but of when. There would be people who challenged it, questioned it, tried to claim a piece of it. Hannah was certain that, the way she was certain of winter coming. "Is he trustworthy?" Noah asked. "Trustworthy enough, and he hates Victor Hale." Noah's eyebrows went up. "Why?" "Hale tried to cheat him on a survey contract 4 years ago. Keene never forgot it." She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. "Most people in this valley have a reason they don't like Victor Hale if you know where to look for it. That's useful to know." She rode to Keene's office herself, leaving Noah at the site with strict instructions to tell no one what they had found and to keep the horses between anyone passing by and the excavation. Henry Keene was in his office going over survey maps when she arrived, and he listened to her describe what they had found with the careful, non-committal expression of a professional man hearing an extraordinary claim. When she finished, he looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You found this by following the horses," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Edward Ellis spent 20 years looking for that aquifer." "I know. And you found it in 4 days." "The horses found it. I just dug where they told me to." Keene looked at her for another long moment. Then he stood, picked up his coat and his case of instruments, and said, "Show me." He spent 3 hours at the site, measuring and marking and recording, crouched over the crack in the stone, with the focused concentration of a man who had discovered something he suspected would define his professional legacy. He didn't speak much while he worked, and Hannah had the good sense not to press him. She stood back and let him do what he did, and she watched the horses, and she thought. By the time Keene straightened up and turned to face her, His expression had shifted from careful professional neutrality to something that had more feeling in it. "I'm going to need to bring in a well driller to confirm the pressure and depth," he said. "But based on what I'm seeing here, the temperature differential, the geological formation, the mineral smell. Mrs. Carter, I believe what your husband's mortgage papers describe as the East 40 acres of worthless clay is sitting directly above one of the most significant freshwater deposits in this part of Montana." Hannah heard the words. She heard them clearly. She let them settle into her chest, making space for them carefully, the way you handle something fragile. "How significant?" she asked. "Significant enough that I would estimate the water rights on this property, properly registered and legally defended, could be worth more than everything else in this valley combined." He paused. "Including the Hale holdings." The silence after that was total. Noah made a sound. A small, involuntary sound, like something escaping from a place he'd been keeping carefully sealed. Hannah said nothing for a moment. Then, "How fast can you have the documentation prepared?" "I can have preliminary findings on paper by tomorrow evening." "Do it. And Mr. Keene, I need this kept between us until the documentation is in order." Keene met her eyes. "Victor Hale? He's been watching this property since Thomas died. He had geological surveys done. I'd bet my life on it. He knew something was here. He just couldn't find it." Keene's jaw tightened. He had his own history with Victor Hale, and it was written plainly on his face. "My office is discretion, Mrs. Carter. Always has been." "Then we understand each other." He left. Hannah stood on the east flats of her dead ranch in the cold October light, with the crack in the stone at her feet, and 80 black horses grazing across the property around her, and she did something she had not permitted herself in 2 weeks. She sat down on the ground, right there, in the dirt, with the cold coming up through Thomas's old coat, and she sat and she breathed, and she let the magnitude of what had just happened move through her without trying to manage it. Noah sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, shoulder almost touching hers, in the way he had of being present when presence was what was needed rather than words. After a while, Hannah said, "Your boots are still too big." "I know. Margaret Ellis said she might have some of her grandson's old ones." "We'll get you to Margaret's this week." "Okay." They sat a while longer. "Mrs. Carter," Noah said finally, "are we going to be all right?" Hannah looked at the horses. At the stallion standing 10 feet away, watching her with his dark eyes and his ancient scar and his unfathomable patience. At the crack in the stone that smelled like the cleanest water she had ever encountered in her life. At 43 acres of cracked clay that was worth, if Keene was right, and she believed he was right, more than Victor Hale had ever managed to steal from anyone. "Yes," she said. "I believe we are." Noah let out a long breath. "Okay," he said again. And then, after a pause, "I told you the horses knew something." "You did," she agreed. "You could have led with that when you told me to go get Mrs. Ellis instead of just saying it was important." "I didn't know for certain yet." "You had a pretty good idea." Noah. "Yes, ma'am?" "Go make sure the southwest fence is holding. The young Mustang's been testing it." He got up. She heard him walk away, and then she heard the particular sound of a 12-year-old boy who is trying very hard not to run and failing at it, and she pressed her lips together against something that wasn't quite a smile, but was headed in that direction. She stayed sitting a moment longer. Then she stood up, brushed the dirt from Thomas's coat, and went to find her shovel. There was still work to do. Margaret came back that evening. She arrived just before supper with a covered pot of beef stew, because Margaret Ellis expressed almost all of her most serious feelings through food, and she sat across the table from Hannah and listened while Hannah told her what Keene had said. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when Hannah finished, Margaret sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her eyes somewhere else for a long moment. "Edward would have wept," she said finally. "I know. He spent so much time looking for it. He borrowed money to buy instruments he thought would help him find it. People laughed at him." She stopped, looked at Hannah directly. "He used to say that animals see what people refuse to. He said if you wanted to know the truth of a piece of land, You should watch what walked across it without a human agenda. Hannah thought of the stallion. The way he moved east with the certainty of something that didn't need to be told where it was going. The way he had stopped in exactly that spot, every morning, with the patience of an animal who was prepared to wait as long as it took for the right person to start paying attention. Mr. Ellis was right, she said. He was right about a great many things. Didn't save him, but he was right. Margaret set down her cup. Now, tell me about the documentation. Keene will have preliminary findings by tomorrow evening. I need to register the water rights with the county clerk as quickly as possible after that. Once it's on record, Hale can't touch it without a legal fight. And a legal fight means a public record, which means everyone finds out, Margaret said, including the 7 families who need that water. Yes. You're going to share it. It wasn't a question. She said it the way people say things they already know the answer to, confirming rather than asking. Hannah looked at her steadily. Every family in this valley is going to have access to this water. I don't know yet exactly what the structure looks like, whether it's a cooperative, whether it's a public utility, whether there's another framework that works better. But no one is going to be charged a price they can't afford for water that the land itself decided to give them. Margaret looked at her for a long time. Victor Hale, she said, is going to come at you very hard when he finds out. I know. He has lawyers in 3 cities. He has political connections all the way to the state capital. He has money enough to tie your claim up in court for years if he chooses to. I know that too. And you're not frightened. Hannah thought about that honestly. I'm frightened of a great many things, she said. I'm frightened of not making the mortgage. I'm frightened of not being able to feed the horses through the winter. I'm frightened of making a legal mistake that costs the families in this valley what they need. She paused. I am not frightened of Victor Hale. Margaret's expression shifted into something that was almost satisfaction. Good, she said. Neither am I. And I have a lawyer. Hannah looked up. You have a lawyer. My nephew Samuel Brooks. He practices in Helena. He's not famous, but he's thorough and he's honest, and he spent 2 years working in water rights before he went into general practice. She picked up her coffee cup again, with the air of someone who has been holding a card and has chosen the right moment to lay it down. I wrote him a letter last week, after you bought the horses. I told him I thought something was coming and that he might want to be available. Hannah stared at her. You did that before we found the spring. I did that the morning after you drove 80 dying horses onto a dead ranch and told Victor Hale to go home, Margaret said simply. Because anyone who does that is either a fool or someone who's about to change something, and I didn't think you were a fool. The gratitude that moved through Hannah in that moment was so specific and so complete that she didn't have words for it that felt adequate. She settled for reaching across the table and putting her hand over Margaret's old, dry hand and pressing it once. Margaret covered Hannah's hand with her other one and pressed back. Now, she said, pulling her hands away and picking up her fork with the brisk practicality of a woman who understood that sentiment was best handled quickly. Tell me about the horses. How are the sick ones doing? Hannah ate and talked, and let the warmth of the kitchen and the beef stew and the steady presence of Margaret Ellis do what those things do when you have been carrying too much alone for too long. Outside, she could hear the herd. 80 black horses moving across the dark property, their hooves on clay, their breath in the cold air, alive, present, finding their way there. The old stallion would be on the east side of the property. She was certain of it without looking. Standing in the dark above the crack in the stone, with the patience of something ancient, waiting. She let herself feel, for the first time in 2 weeks, that waiting might have an end to it. 3 days later, Henry Keene delivered his preliminary survey findings, signed and witnessed, to Hannah's kitchen table. That same afternoon, Hannah rode into town and filed a formal claim with the county clerk for the water rights on the eastern portion of her property. The clerk, a thin, fussy man named Aldous Price, took the paperwork with the bureaucratic neutrality of someone whose professional life consisted entirely of processing documents and who had learned not to react to their contents. But his hand stilled for just a moment when he read what the document described. This is, Mrs. Carter, do you understand what you're claiming here? I do. An underground spring of this magnitude. There are going to be questions. There are going to be interested parties. I expect so. That's why I'm filing it properly. He looked at her over the top of the document. Then he stamped it, recorded it in the registry, and handed her the copy. Filed, he said. October 18th, 1886. She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket, next to the original bill of sale for 80 black horses. And she walked out of the county clerk's office into the cold afternoon light, and she stopped on the wooden sidewalk and breathed in the October air. The claim was on record. Victor Hale would find out. It was only a matter of time before Aldous Price, or someone who'd seen her in the office that afternoon, mentioned it to someone who would mention it to someone who would end up, in the chain of gossip way of small towns, in the ear of the most powerful man in the valley. She had maybe 48 hours, she estimated. Possibly less. She needed those 48 hours to count. She rode directly to the Ellis property and sent the letter Margaret had drafted to Samuel Brooks in Helena, marked urgent, requesting that he travel to Redstone Valley as quickly as possible. Then she rode to see Jacob Miller, whose ranch bordered her southern fence line and who had been one of the loudest voices at the auction calling her purchase insane, because Jacob Miller had 300 acres of land that was dying of thirst and a family who needed water more than most, and because Hannah had made a decision about how this was going to go, and she needed people in her corner before Hale started working on them. Jacob Miller answered his door with the expression of a man bracing for something he deserved. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Miller, I have something I need to tell you. Can I come in?" He opened the door wider. She told him. He sat at his kitchen table and listened with his big, sun-worn hands flat on the wood and his face going through a series of expressions that traveled from disbelief to calculation to something quieter that might have been shame. When she finished, he looked at his hands for a moment. Then, "You found this by following those horses?" "Yes." "The horses everyone said you were a fool for buying?" "Yes." He was quiet. Outside his window, she could see his field, brown and cracked and desperate for exactly what she was describing. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. "I need you to be at the town meeting when it happens. I need you to tell the truth about what you know and what you've seen. And I need you to tell it before Victor Hale has a chance to change the story." He met her eyes. "You think he'll try?" "He already owns the story of this valley, Mr. Miller. He's been buying it piece by piece for 6 years. I intend to change what that story says, but I need people who know the truth to say it out loud." Jacob Miller looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men nod in the West when they are making a commitment they intend to keep. "I'll be there," he said. She rode home in the last light of the afternoon, and she was 200 yards from her gate when she saw the rider at the end of her drive. She knew the coat before she could see the face. That particular shade of dark wool, that particular straightness in the saddle. Victor Hale. He had found out faster than she'd estimated. She rode up to him without slowing her pace, stopped her horse at the gate, and looked at him across the 10 feet of cold October air between them. "Mr. Hale," she said. His expression was not the calibrated pleasantness of their previous meeting. It was still controlled. It was always controlled. But beneath the control, underneath the smooth professional surface of the man, something had shifted. Something had gotten tighter. The expression of a man who had just discovered that a game he thought he was winning has been played, for some portion of time he cannot yet calculate, by rules he didn't know about. "You filed a water rights claim today," he said. "I did." "On the basis of a survey conducted by Henry Keene." "That's correct." He looked at her. The wind moved between them. Behind her on the property, she could hear the herd. 80 horses moving across the clay in the last of the day's light. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and his voice had the careful evenness of a man choosing each word with precision. "I want you to understand something. I have been in this valley for 6 years. I have built relationships with every significant person in this county. I have legal resources that you cannot match and political connections that extend well beyond the borders of Redstone Valley. I am telling you this not to threaten you, but to help you understand the landscape." "That's very considerate of you," Hannah said. "The sensible thing, the genuinely sensible thing, would be to sit down with my attorneys and discuss a partnership arrangement. You have found something significant on your property. I am in a position to help you develop it in a way that benefits everyone and ensures that you and your—" He glanced past her, toward the barn where Noah had just appeared in the doorway, and the pause before his next word was deliberate. "Your family are provided for." Hannah looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hale," she said, "when I came home from the county clerk's office today, I stopped and I thought about what this water means for every family in this valley. I thought about the Millers and the Henrys and the Bowen family and every other family that's been watching their land die for 3 years while you've been buying it up from underneath them. And I made a decision." She held his gaze. "I'm not interested in a partnership. I'm not interested in development arrangements. That water belongs to this valley, and every family in it is going to have access to it on terms they can afford. That's not a negotiating position. That's a decision." Hale looked at her for a long moment. The wind, the sound of horses. "You are," he said finally, quietly, "making a very significant mistake." "I don't think so." "Then we have nothing further to discuss tonight." "No," she agreed. "We don't." He turned his horse and rode away down the drive. Noah appeared at her shoulder. "He knows." "He knows." "What does that mean?" Hannah watched the retreating figure until it cleared the end of the drive and disappeared onto the main road. She thought about what Margaret had said. She thought about Samuel Brooks and his water rights background and the urgent letter already heading to Helena. She thought about Jacob Miller saying, "I'll be there," in that serious, committed voice. She thought about the water rising through the crack in the stone. The oldest thing in the valley, pressing up through the dark, finding its way. "It means," she said, "that the easy part is over." She didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid. She had moved through fear and out the other side of it somewhere around the moment she counted $33 into a government man's hand and bought 80 dying horses with the last of everything she had. What kept her awake that night was calculation. The same cold, methodical calculation she had been running since the morning after Thomas's funeral. Except now the numbers had changed, and the stakes had changed with them, and she needed to understand the new landscape completely before Victor Hale started reshaping it to his advantage. Because he would start. She had seen it in his eyes when he rode away from her gate, that particular quality of controlled anger that men like Victor Hale wore when a situation had moved outside the boundaries they'd prepared for it. She had maybe 24 hours, she estimated now, possibly less. He would spend tonight on his own calculations. By morning, he would have a strategy. She needed hers to be better. She got up at 3 in the morning and lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table with her journal open and her pencil moving, and she worked through every angle she could find. Legal position. Water rights filed, on record. Keene's documentation thorough and signed. That was solid. Political position. Weaker. Hale had 6 years of relationship building in this county, and she had a widow's modest standing and a reputation, currently, for buying animals no one wanted. She needed to change that ratio before Hale found a way to define the story. Community position. The key. The families who needed the water. The Millers, the Henrys, the Bowens, the Proctors, the Caldwells. They were the ones whose voices would matter when this became public, and they needed to hear the truth from her before they heard a different version from Hale. She made a list. 7 families. She would ride to every one of them tomorrow. She was still writing when she heard the horses move outside. That familiar pre-dawn percussion of hooves on clay, heading east. And she looked up at the dark window and felt something steady itself inside her chest. They were still going. The stallion was still leading them to the place they had always known about. The place no human had been patient enough to find until she had been desperate enough to follow them there. She thought about Margaret's words. Animals see what people refuse to notice. She looked down at her list. She added an 8th name, Reverend Pierce. If she was going to get in front of this story before Hale controlled it, she needed the one voice in Redstone Valley that carried moral authority independent of money. At 5 in the morning, she heard Noah stir in the barn, heard him begin the morning rounds with the horses, heard his voice, low and steady, the same tone he always used with the animals. moving from stall to stall. She made coffee. She made a large pot of oatmeal, enough for both of them. She thought about Thomas. Not with grief, not of this morning, with something more useful. She thought about what Thomas would have done, and the answer came back clearly, because Thomas had been, underneath the gentleness, a man who understood confrontation. He would have ridden into town and made every conversation public before Hale could make any of them private. He would have stood in front of people and told the truth loudly enough that it couldn't be quietly contradicted. That was what she was going to do. She was saddled and moving by 7 in the morning, before the October sun had cleared the eastern ridge. She went to Jacob Miller first, because she had already opened that door, and because Miller's land bordered 6 other properties, and his word carried weight in the eastern part of the valley. She didn't stay long. She told him what she needed and when, confirmed he understood, and moved. The Henry family was next. Robert Henry answered the door looking like he'd already had a hard morning, which in drought country in October was entirely possible. And when Hannah told him what she had found and what she intended to do with it, he stood in his doorway for a long moment without speaking. His wife appeared at his shoulder. Hannah told it again. Mrs. Henry made a sound, involuntary, brief, that told Hannah everything she needed to know about how close to the edge they were. "You're giving access to everyone," Robert Henry said. "Everyone in this valley, yes." He looked at his wife. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was too intimate and too specific for Hannah to read completely, but the shape of it was clear enough. "What do you need us to do?" Mrs. Henry said. "Come to the town meeting when it's called. Tell the truth about your situation. That's all I need. 3 properties. 3 conversations." By mid-morning, Hannah was at the Bowen Ranch, then the Proctors, then the Caldwells, and in each house she found the same thing. People who were frightened and exhausted, and who listened to what she said with the particular intensity of the desperate. Not one of them doubted her. That surprised her slightly, and then she thought about it, and it didn't surprise her at all, because desperate people have a talent for recognizing when someone is telling the truth, the same way starving animals have a talent for finding water. It was at the Caldwell place that she first got the indication that Hale had moved faster than she'd planned for. Ellen Caldwell met her at the door with a face that was trying to be welcoming and was not succeeding. Inside, Hannah could hear voices, male voices, the particular cadence of a professional conversation. Ellen Caldwell said, "Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry, we have a visitor at the moment." And then the door behind her opened further, and Richard Caldwell appeared with his expression arranged into something uncomfortable. And behind Richard Caldwell, seated at the kitchen table with a leather document case open in front of him, was a man Hannah didn't recognize. Young, polished. The kind of suit that had been purchased in a city. One of Hale's lawyers. He was already here. He stood when Hannah came in, courtesy, training, and introduced himself as Mr. Forsyth, representing the interests of Mr. Victor Hale in a matter concerning water rights in the Eastern Valley Basin. He was smooth and he was quick, and Hannah could see immediately that he was good at his job. His voice had the particular quality of someone who had learned how to make legal manipulation sound like genuine concern. "Mrs. Carter," he said pleasantly. "What a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Forsyth. I was just explaining to the Caldwells that there are some significant legal questions about the water rights claim filed yesterday. Questions of ownership, of access, of whether a single private individual can legally claim exclusive rights to a water source that sits beneath a shared geological formation." He said it well. He said it in a way that made it sound reasonable. Hannah watched Richard Caldwell's face while Forsyth talked and saw the confusion starting to work its way in. The reasonable-sounding doubt, the first hint of, "Did we get this wrong?" planting itself in soil that was already vulnerable with exhaustion and need. She had about 30 seconds to counteract it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, cutting across Forsyth's next sentence without ceremony, "I have a question for you. In the 6 years that Victor Hale has owned Copper Creek water rights, has his price for access gone up or down?" Caldwell blinked. "Up. Every year." "By how much this year?" A pause. 40%. "And can you continue to afford that trajectory?" The answer was on his face before he opened his mouth. No. I am offering every family in this valley access to the spring on my land at a price they can afford. Fixed. In writing. Cooperative structure, meaning you have a voice in how it's managed. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Forsyth is going to tell you that my legal claim is questionable. I'd like to point out that my legal claim has been filed with the county clerk, documented by Henry Keene, and is being reviewed by an attorney who specializes in water rights. If Mr. Hale wishes to challenge it, he is welcome to do so in court, where the facts will be on the record and available for everyone to read. Forsyth's pleasant expression had developed a slight tightness at the edges. Mrs. Carter, I think, he began. I think, Hannah said, that Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell deserve to make this decision without a lawyer in the room who is being paid by the man who benefits if they decide wrong. So I'm going to leave. She looked at Ellen Caldwell. Come to the town meeting. Hear both sides. Then decide. She left. She was back on her horse and moving down the Caldwell Drive before she allowed herself to process the fact that her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the particular adrenaline of a confrontation you've walked into without knowing it was waiting and had to navigate by instinct and hadn't, so far as she could tell, made worse. Hale had lawyers at the Caldwells. That meant he'd had time to mobilize overnight, which meant he'd started making calls before he rode to her gate. He'd found out about the filing before she'd thought he had, and he'd been moving on his strategy while she was still calculating hers. She needed to think differently about the timeline. She rode hard to Reverend Pierce's house. Pierce was in his study when she arrived, a square, solid man in his 60s with the kind of face that went with a lifetime of listening to things people needed to say without judgment. He heard her out completely, without interrupting, with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes steady on hers. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Victor Hale had someone in my congregation at my door this morning, he said. Hannah went still. Who? Mr. Forsyth. I don't know if that's his real name. He suggested that your water rights claim might be legally problematic, and that if I were to encourage my congregation to support it, I might be leading them toward an uncertain legal situation. The Reverend paused. He suggested it in the tone of a man who believes that a clergyman's concern for his flock can be leveraged. Can it? Hannah said, and she kept her voice completely neutral. Pierce met her eyes. Mrs. Carter, I have been in this valley for 22 years. I have watched Victor Hale buy land from families in distress, and I have watched those families come to me afterward with the particular grief of people who understood too late what they'd sold. I held my tongue because I believed it wasn't my place to involve myself in business matters. He paused. I was wrong about that. I won't be wrong about it again. The gratitude was almost physical. Hannah pressed it down. The town meeting? I'll be there, and I'll speak. He looked at her across the desk. Now, tell me about the horses, because I've been hearing the story from 3 different people this morning, and I want to hear it from you, she told him. All of it. The holding yard, the $25, the stallion moving east every morning, the crack in the stone, the smell of clean water rising through the dark. She told it plainly, without embellishment, and she watched his face while she talked. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the expression of a man turning something over in his mind until it settles. In the book of Job, he said, the wisdom of animals is invoked as evidence that the earth holds knowledge that humans have not been given the pride to receive. He looked at her. I'm not a man who trades in the miraculous, Mrs. Carter. I'm a practical man. But I have been a practical man long enough to know that the boundaries between practical and miraculous are considerably less fixed than we generally like to believe. They found the water, Hannah said simply. I just dug. You did considerably more than dig. You trusted what you saw when every rational voice in your life was telling you it was grief and poor judgment. He paused. That is not a small thing. She rode home in the early afternoon, and she was 3 miles from the ranch when she saw the smoke. Not much of it. A thin gray column, wrong color for a cook fire, rising from the direction of her property. She pressed her horse into a gallop without deciding to, the fear coming up fast and cold in her chest, and she covered the 3 miles in less than 10 minutes and came through her gate at speed and found Noah standing in the yard with a bucket in his hand and water on the front of his shirt, and his face pale and shaken. The barn wall on the south side was scorched black in a section roughly 4 feet across. The fire was out, but the smell of it was still in the air, sharp and chemical in a way that hay fires weren't. Not an accident. Noah was breathing hard. I smelled it before I saw it, caught it fast. It wasn't. I don't think it was hot long enough to. He stopped, swallowed. It didn't get inside. The horses? Moved them to the east field when I smelled it. They're okay. Hannah dismounted and walked to the scorched section and looked at it closely without touching. She had grown up on a ranch. She knew what hay fire damage looked like and what it smelled like and how it moved, and this was not hay. This was something applied deliberately, something designed to catch fast and hot and spread. She stood at the scorched wall for a long moment, looking at it. Behind her, she heard Noah set down his bucket. He came to stand beside her and looked at the same black mark on the same boards and said quietly, "He's telling you something." "Yes." "Are you scared?" She thought about the honest answer. "I'm angry," she said. "There's a difference." She went inside and wrote a letter to the county sheriff, describing what she had found and requesting that it be documented as a potential act of deliberate property destruction. She wrote it carefully and precisely, using the kind of language that created an official record, and she had Noah write it to the sheriff's office personally because she didn't trust it to anyone else. Then she went to check the horses. The herd was on the east flats, as Noah had said, spread across the ground above the spring in the afternoon light. They were calmer than she would have expected, given that they had been moved quickly and there had been smoke and noise. The old stallion was in his usual spot, standing with his 4 feet planted on the cracked earth above the water, as if he had decided that this was the piece of ground he was responsible for, and he was not moving from it for anything. Hannah sat down on the ground near him and watched the herd. She needed to think. The fire was a message. She understood that. But it was also evidence of something she hadn't fully accounted for in her calculations. Hale was willing to move into illegal territory. She had assumed he would stay on the legal side. Pressure, lawyers, documentation challenges, political maneuvering. The fire changed the picture. The fire said that he was more invested in this property than even she had estimated, which meant that what was beneath it was worth more than she had estimated, which meant Keene's assessment of significance had been, if anything, conservative. The fire was frightening, but as information, it was useful. Samuel Brooks arrived 2 days later. He was younger than Hannah had expected, 34, 35, with the careful bearing of a man who had spent his career being underestimated and had learned to let it work for him. He came with 2 leather satchels full of documents and a mind that, in the first hour of conversation, Hannah recognized as being considerably sharper than his unimpressive arrival suggested. He sat at her kitchen table and listened to the complete history. The horses, the survey, the filing, Hale's lawyers, the fire. Without interrupting, with a pencil moving steadily across his notepad. When she finished, he looked up. "Tell me everything you know about Hale's acquisition of the other 4 ranches in this valley," he said. "Every detail. I don't care if it seems relevant." She told him everything she knew, which was more than she had realized she knew until she started talking. She talked for an hour. Brooks wrote for an hour, and she watched his face while she talked, and she saw the moment. Somewhere in the middle of the story of the Collins Ranch, the second acquisition, 3 years ago, when something clicked behind his eyes. A connection being made, a piece of a pattern snapping into place. She stopped. "What is it?" "Keep going," he said. "I'll tell you when you finish." She kept going. When she was done, he set down his pencil and looked at her across the table. "I need to go to Helena," he said. "There's something in what you've just told me that requires me to pull some records. State Land Office, and possibly the Federal Geological Survey Office." He paused. "I think Victor Hale may have had access to federal survey data about underground water in this valley before he began purchasing land here. If that's true, and I want to be clear that this is a hypothesis right now, not a fact. If it's true, then several of his property acquisitions may have been conducted with material information that was withheld from the sellers." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's fraud," Hannah said. At the federal level, potentially. Yes. He held up one hand. I need records before we go anywhere near that word in public. But I need you to understand what I'm looking for, so that you understand why the next 2 weeks are going to matter very much, and why it is critical that you do nothing that gives Hale's legal team any grounds to challenge your position in the meantime. Such as, don't restrict access to the spring, don't charge for access, don't make any public statements about the value of the water rights. Just keep doing what you're doing. Open access, no conditions. Let the community see your intention before anyone can characterize it differently. That was already my plan. He looked at her for a moment. Margaret said you were steady, he said. I see what she meant. The next morning, Hannah opened the spring. Not formally. She didn't announce it, didn't post a notice, didn't send word through the town. She simply had Noah redirect the surface water that was beginning to pool above the breach in the stone into a wooden trough that Thomas had built years ago for the horses, and she opened the east gate of the property, and she told the first 3 people she saw in the course of normal business that day that anyone who needed water could come to the Carter Ranch and fill whatever they brought. By the end of the week, there were families coming from 5 miles away. It was Jacob Miller who first brought his whole family, wife, 3 children, 2 large barrels on the wagon bed. And he came in the morning and filled his barrels, and when he was done, he stood in Hannah's yard and looked at her with an expression that had shame in it, and decency in it, and something resolving itself that had been unresolved for a while. I said some things at that auction, he said, about you and the horses. Yes, I was wrong. You were scared, Hannah said. There's a difference, though I take your point. He put his hat back on. I'll be at the town meeting. She nodded. He loaded his family and his barrels and drove off down the drive. His youngest daughter, a girl of about 8 with her mother's red hair, waved at Hannah from the back of the wagon. Hannah raised a hand in return. Then the trouble started in earnest. It came first through the Redstone Valley Gazette, where a notice appeared stating that the water rights claim filed by Mrs. Hannah Carter on the 18th of October was under formal legal challenge by a consortium of interested parties, unnamed, though not difficult to guess, on the grounds that the geological formation in question extended across property lines and therefore could not be claimed by a single private landowner. The notice was written in precise legal language and was positioned next to a letter from an anonymous local resident expressing concern that one individual's claim to the valley's water could endanger everyone's long-term security. The letter was well written, too well written for an anonymous local resident. Hannah read it 3 times and recognized the careful architecture of a professional, someone who knew exactly which fears to push and how to push them without sounding like a threat. He's going to try to make me the villain, she said to Margaret, who was at the kitchen table reading the same paper. He's already started, Margaret said. 3 people came to my door yesterday asking me if it was true you were planning to sell the water rights to a railroad company. Hannah stared at her. Where did that come from? Hale's people. It's being circulated quietly. Nothing official, nothing that can be traced back. Just the rumor, just enough to make people uncertain. Margaret set the paper down. He's been doing this for 6 years, Hannah. He's very good at it. How do I fight a rumor? You don't fight it. You replace it. Margaret looked at her steadily. Samuel needs to move faster, she telegraphed Brooks and Helena that afternoon. His reply came the following morning, and when Noah handed her the telegraph envelope, Hannah read it standing in the yard and went very still. She read it twice. Then she walked inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Noah stood in the doorway. He had learned, over the past weeks, to read the precise quality of her stillness, to know the difference between the stillness of someone managing bad news and the stillness of someone managing news that was too large for immediate movement. Good or bad? He asked. She looked up. Samuel found the geological surveys, she said. Federal surveys, conducted 5 years ago, and the records show they were accessed by an agent of Victor Hale's land acquisition company 6 weeks before Hale began purchasing property in this valley. Noah's breath came out slow. So he knew. He knew exactly what was under this land. He knew before he made a single offer to a single family. Every person who sold to him, they sold without knowing what they were giving up. Noah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, does that mean he committed? It means, Hannah said carefully, because Brooks had been careful, and she was going to be careful too, that there are very significant questions about the ethics and legality of his acquisitions in this valley. And it means that when those questions become public, every person in this county who ever sold land to Victor Hale is going to have reason to want answers. The enormity of it was almost difficult to look at directly. She understood now, fully, completely, with no room left for doubt, why Hale had wanted her land from the moment Thomas died. He had known. He had known all along what was beneath the eastern flats. He had watched Thomas fight to keep the ranch alive for years, had waited for the moment of maximum vulnerability, and had moved in with his low offer and his smooth voice and his calculated patience. The fire on the barn wall looked different from this angle. Not just a warning. A desperate move from a man who understood that if the truth about those geological surveys became public, everything he had built in this valley was built on fraud, and it was going to come apart. She needed to get to Samuel Brooks. She was saddled and ready to ride for the telegraph office to arrange for Brooks to come immediately when she heard horses coming fast up her drive. Not one horse, multiple, moving at a pace that had urgency in it. She came out of the barn and stopped. There were 4 of them. Men she didn't know, not Hale's lawyer, not anyone she recognized from town. They pulled up in the yard, and the one in front, big, with the kind of face that had done rough work and not minded it, looked down at her from his horse with an expression that was not hostile, but was not anything else either. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "Mr. Hale asked us to remind you that the town meeting is Thursday. He wanted to make sure you'd received the notice." He said it pleasantly. The 3 behind him said nothing. They sat their horses with the particular quality of men who are making a point through presence rather than words. Hannah looked at each of them in turn. She looked at the one who had spoken. She looked at him steadily for long enough to be clear that she was not moving her eyes away from his face because of anything he was doing or might do. "Tell Mr. Hale," she said, "that I'll be there." The man nodded once. They turned their horses and rode back down the drive. Noah appeared from behind the barn, where he had, apparently, been watching. He came to stand beside her in the yard, and they both watched the 4 riders go. "He sent men to remind you about a meeting," Noah said. "Yes." "That's not really about the meeting, is it?" "No." Noah looked at the retreating horses. His jaw had tightened in the way it did when he was angry and managing it. "He's trying to make you feel alone," he said. Hannah looked at him sideways. Sometimes the boy understood things with a directness that moved through her like a current. "Yes," she said. "He is." "Is it working?" She thought about Margaret Ellis in her kitchen. She thought about Reverend Pierce and his 22 years of watching this valley. She thought about Jacob Miller's daughter waving from the back of a wagon. She thought about Robert Henry's face when she told him about the spring. She thought about 7 families who had driven to her east gate with barrels and buckets and the urgent thirst of people whose land was dying. "No," she said, "it isn't." She went back inside and telegraphed Brooks to come. Then she went to the East Flats and she sat on the ground near the spring, and she listened to the sound of water moving beneath stone, ancient, patient, utterly indifferent to Victor Hale, and she let it steady her the way it always did. The stallion stood 5 feet away and watched the horizon with his dark, scarred eyes. Thursday was 4 days away. She had 4 days to get ready. She spent every one of them working. Brooks arrived by stage on Wednesday afternoon, looking road-worn, but carrying his 2 leather satchels with the purposeful grip of a man who knew what was in them and what they were worth. He sat at her kitchen table until midnight, going through documents with Hannah and Margaret, and, for 2 hours in the evening, with Henry Keene, who brought his own survey records and spread them across the table alongside Brooks's federal documents, and they cross-referenced everything, line by line, with the careful precision of people building something that needed to be airtight. At 10 o'clock that night, Keene looked up from the documents with an expression Hannah had not seen on his professional face before. He had a survey of the Eastern Basin specifically, Keene said. Not a general area survey. a specific, targeted survey of the formation beneath the Carter property, conducted 4 months before Thomas Carter's first missed mortgage payment. The room was very quiet. 4 months before, Margaret said. He may have been watching for the moment the financial pressure would be high enough, Brooks said carefully, his pen moving. That would need to be established separately, but the timeline is notable. Hannah looked at the documents spread across her kitchen table. She looked at the numbers and the dates and the names, and she thought about Thomas. Thomas sick in his bed, fighting to breathe, worrying about the mortgage, not knowing that the man who had already decided to take his land was watching the clock and waiting for the right moment to move. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Thursday," she said. "What we have, is it enough?" Brooks looked at her. "For the town meeting, yes, more than enough. For any subsequent legal proceedings, we'll need more time and more documentation." He paused. "But what we have tonight will change the room. I can promise you that." "Then let's make sure we're ready to use it." They worked until midnight. Outside, the horses moved across the dark property, their hooves steady on the cracked clay, and the water pressed upward through the stone, finding its way through the dark, the way it had been finding its way for longer than anyone in that kitchen had been alive, patient and certain, and completely indifferent to the uses that men made of the ground above it. Thursday morning came cold and clear. Hannah dressed in her best, not her widow's dress. She was done with that particular armor. Her blue wool, the one Thomas had liked, with the good buttons. She put her hair up properly. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she saw a woman who had buried her husband 6 weeks ago and spent every day since, in a fight she hadn't chosen and wasn't going to lose, and she thought that was enough information for a face to carry into a room. Noah came to the kitchen door in his best shirt, his hair combed flat, his boots, the new ones Margaret had found from her grandson's box, properly laced. "Ready?" he said. Hannah picked up her coat and her journal and the leather case that held her copies of the documentation. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." The town hall was already full when Hannah arrived. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the faces, not who was there or where they were standing, but the density of it, the sheer number of people who had come out on a cold Thursday morning in late October to a meeting that Victor Hale had called and framed and intended to control. Every bench was taken. People stood along the back wall and both side walls and spilled out toward the door she had just walked through. And the noise of that many people in one room doing the particular kind of talking that happens when everyone is pretending to be calmer than they are was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. She felt every eye in the room find her the moment she stepped inside. She didn't slow down. Noah was at her left shoulder. Samuel Brooks was at her right, carrying his leather satchels with the quiet authority of a man who understood that how you entered a room told people something important about what was going to happen inside it. Margaret Ellis had arrived 20 minutes earlier and was seated in the third row on the left side with Reverend Pierce beside her, both of them straight-backed and still in the way of people who have decided what they are going to do and are simply waiting for the moment to do it. Hannah walked to the front of the room and took a seat on the right side, facing the podium, and she set her case on her knees and she looked straight ahead. Victor Hale was already at the front. He stood near the podium with 2 men Hannah recognized as his attorneys, Forsyth from the Caldwell house and another she hadn't seen before. And he was talking to someone, unhurried, relaxed in the way that men are relaxed when they have decided they have already won. He didn't look at Hannah when she came in. That was deliberate. She recognized it as deliberate because it was too consistent to be anything else. Frank Dalton called the meeting to order. He was the Valley's self-appointed civic voice, not an elected position, simply a function of his having lived here longest and spoken loudest, and no one having organized themselves sufficiently to stop him. He stood at the podium and talked for 5 minutes about community, about cooperation, about the challenges facing Redstone Valley in the current drought, and about the importance of addressing difficult matters through proper civic process. He said Victor Hale's name with the particular warmth people reserve for someone whose money they have received or expect to receive. Then he turned the floor over to Hale. Victor Hale walked to the podium with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this many times in many rooms, and had learned that the first 30 seconds were everything. He took his time. He looked around the room. He nodded at faces he knew, which was most of them. And he projected, simply through his posture and his patience, the image of a man who was here to help. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I know how much time costs this time of year, and I don't intend to waste it." He began with sympathy. He expressed his deepest condolences regarding Thomas Carter's death, which made Hannah's jaw tighten, though she kept her face entirely still. He talked about the drought and what it had cost the families in this valley. He talked about his own investment in this community, the businesses he had supported, the employment he had created, the responsible management of Copper Creek that had ensured some water access through the worst of the dry years. How was good? She had known he would be good, but he was better than she had given him credit for. Warm without being cloying, authoritative without being aggressive, reasonable sounding in every particular. He built his case in layers, each one sounding fair until you tried to see the whole structure. The water rights claim, he explained, raised significant legal questions. Not because Hannah Carter's intentions were bad. He was very careful here, generous even, noting that her generosity in opening access to the spring had been commendable, but because the geological formation in question did not respect property lines. An underground aquifer of this type, he explained with the confident authority of a man who had paid geologists to give him language, was by its nature a shared resource. Privatizing it, even with good intentions, created risks for the entire valley. What happened when the private owner needed to sell? What happened when circumstances changed? The security of the entire valley's water supply could not be left dependent on the goodwill of any single individual. He let that settle. Then he laid out his proposal. A water management authority, professionally administered, with representation from major stakeholders across the valley. He was careful not to say his name in connection with leadership of this authority. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room who had been watching Victor Hale operate for 6 years understood perfectly whose hands would be on the levers of any institution he proposed. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then there was a murmur, the sound of people who had found something convincing and were not yet sure what to do with that. Hannah watched faces. She watched Robert Henry's face, which was uncertain. She watched the Caldwells, who were whispering to each other. She watched the back of the room where a dozen people she didn't know well were nodding slowly in the way people nod when they are being persuaded. Frank Dalton opened the floor. 3 people spoke before Hannah did, and 2 of them were favorable to Hale's position. Not enthusiastically, but in the cautious way of people who have heard something reasonable and don't yet have a reason to doubt it. The third was a man named Proctor, who had been coming to Hannah's spring for a week, and who said simply, and with feeling, that he had drunk Carter water and it was good water, and he trusted the woman who offered it. The room received him with the respectful embarrassment reserved for honesty that is slightly inconvenient. Then Frank Dalton looked at Hannah and nodded. She stood. She didn't go to the podium. She stood where she was, in the middle of the room, because the podium was Hale's chosen ground, and she wasn't going to fight on his terrain. She stood with her journal in one hand and her case in the other, and she spoke clearly enough to reach the back wall. 6 weeks ago, she said, I buried my husband. 3 days after the funeral, Victor Hale's people were asking around about my property. That is a fact. I'm not saying it to generate sympathy. I'm saying it because it's where this story begins, and you deserve to know where it begins. She had their attention. The murmur stopped. I spent $33 on 80 dying horses because I had nothing left to lose, and I believed those animals deserved better than what they were getting. Everyone in this room who was there that day knows what was said about that decision. She paused. Some of you said it yourselves. I don't hold that against you. Grief makes people look foolish to those who aren't carrying it. She watched Jacob Miller's jaw tighten in the 3rd row. Those horses found the spring, not me. I followed them, and I dug where they stopped, and I found what they already knew was there. And the moment I filed a legal claim on those water rights, Victor Hale began a campaign to take them from me. Forsyth, from his position near the wall, stirred. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not finished, Mr. Forsyth." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes moving around the room, connecting with faces, reading what was there. Mr. Hale made a compelling presentation. He talked about shared resources and community security and responsible management. "I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the Federal Geological Survey that was conducted in this valley 5 years ago." The room shifted. Not dramatic. A subtle change in posture, in the quality of attention. That survey identified a significant underground water formation in the eastern basin of this valley. It was a federal survey, conducted with federal resources, and the results were filed with the Federal Land Office and are part of the public record. She opened her case and lifted a document. "Mr. Brooks." Samuel Brooks stood and walked to her. He handed her a second document. "The records also show," she continued, her voice completely even, "that 6 weeks after that survey was filed, a representative of the Hale Land Acquisition Company accessed those records at the Federal Land Office in Helena." She held up the document. 6 weeks after reviewing federal survey data indicating significant underground water in the Eastern Valley Basin, Victor Hale began purchasing land in this valley. The silence that fell was different from the silence after Hale had spoken. That silence had been the silence of people who had found something convincing. This silence was the silence of people who were understanding something, and what they were understanding was changing the shape of everything they had already heard. She let it breathe. The Collins family sold their 300 acres to Victor Hale 3 years ago. They sold because they needed water and believed the land was drying out and had no future. She looked at the Collins family. They were in the room, 2 older people near the back, and she saw the moment her words landed on them like a physical thing. The Henderson family sold the following year. The Wheelers sold the year after that. She named each one. Every family that sold believed they were selling land that had no future. They were not told what the federal survey had found. They were not told that the man buying their property had reason to believe significant water existed beneath the eastern basin. Victor Hale had been still throughout this. He was still now. But the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a man who is confident. It was the stillness of a man who is managing something that requires all of his control to manage. "That's a very serious allegation, Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was smooth, impressively smooth, and one that is completely— "Mr. Brooks," Hannah said. Brooks stood again. He spoke for 7 minutes. He was not dramatic about it. He laid out dates, document numbers, the chain of access records from the Federal Land Office, the timeline of Hale's acquisitions against the timeline of the survey, with the precise, methodical delivery of a man who has spent his career making complicated things impossible to misunderstand. He cited 4 specific transactions. He named the specific agent who had accessed the survey records on Hale's behalf. He produced copies of the relevant federal documents and had Noah pass them to Henry Keene, who was seated in the front row, and Keene looked at them and nodded once, the nod of a professional man confirming what he is reading against what he already knows. When Brooks sat down, the room was the kind of quiet that is not actually quiet at all. It was the sound of 70 people thinking very hard, very fast. Hale's senior attorney, not Forsyth, the other one, stood. "The documents Mr. Brooks has cited are survey records, nothing more. Access to public federal records is not evidence of—" "Sit down, Warner." The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. A man Hannah had never seen before was standing near the back wall. He was perhaps 60, with the careful, weathered look of someone who had spent a career outdoors. He was holding his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had been deciding something for a long time and had finally decided it. "My name is Charles Addison," he said to the room. "I was the survey team leader for the Federal Water Survey in this valley 5 years ago. I've been living in Billings since the work was done, and I read about this meeting in a letter from a colleague. I came because—" He stopped. His hands turned his hat. "Because the survey we conducted was federal work, and I know what it found, and I know what was done with those findings, and I have been carrying that knowledge for 5 years, and I am done carrying it." Hale's attorney said sharply, "Mr. Addison, I would strongly advise—" The survey was complete, Addison said, ignoring him. We found a significant pre-glacial aquifer beneath the eastern basin. The pressure mapping indicated surface access was achievable within 20 feet of depth in multiple locations on the eastern portion of what was then the Carter Ranch. He looked directly at Victor Hale. The results were filed with the Federal Land Office. 3 weeks after we filed, a man came to my camp and identified himself as representing a private land investment company. He offered me $200 to delay publication of the survey summary in the Valley Gazette. I told him I couldn't do that. He left. 1 week later, I received a letter from a federal administrator suggesting my methodology had been questioned and recommending I not publicize the findings pending review. He paused. That review was never conducted. The findings were buried in the federal archive and not publicized in this valley. I have been wondering for 5 years who wrote that letter and who was behind it. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. I kept it. The attorney was on his feet. Hale's hand went out and stopped him. A small, precise gesture. The room was absolutely motionless. Hannah watched Victor Hale's face. She had been watching it for the past 10 minutes, watching the control that was his defining characteristic. Holding, holding, holding. And now she watched it perform one final calculation. She watched him look at Addison's envelope, and at Brooks's documents, and at Keene's nod, and at the 70 faces in the room that were no longer looking at him with the deference of people who have found something convincing, but with something else entirely. She watched him decide. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat from the bench beside him. He looked at Hannah with an expression that she had no name for. Not anger, not defeat. Something more complicated than either. Something that might, if she were being generous, have contained a fraction of recognition. Then he walked out. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, and his attorneys fell in behind him, and the door opened, and they were gone. The room erupted. Hannah stood in the middle of it. In the middle of 70 people talking at once, turning to each other. The Addison envelope going forward hand to hand toward Brooks, the Collins family in the back gripping each other's hands, Jacob Miller on his feet saying something loud that she couldn't quite make out over everything else. And she held herself very still and let the noise move around her like water around a stone. Noah appeared at her elbow. He just left, the boy said, sounding as though he still couldn't entirely believe it. Yes. Just walked out. When a man like that runs out of room to maneuver, he stops talking and starts thinking about the next move. He'll be at his lawyer's office before we get home. She looked at Brooks, who was already examining Addison's envelope with Keene beside him, both of them speaking quietly and quickly. But we've changed the ground he's standing on. That's what matters today. Reverend Pierce worked his way through the crowd to stand before her. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The look of a man who is feeling something he is choosing to keep dignified. Well, he said finally. Well, she agreed. I believe I owe you an apology, he said. Not for anything I did. For 22 years of not doing more. Reverend, I'll be speaking to my congregation on Sunday, he said firmly. At some length. Frank Dalton, to his credit, had the grace to look uncomfortable. He came to Hannah with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man performing a calculation about which direction the wind was now definitively blowing. Mrs. Carter, he said, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I think we have different memories of how the foot started, she said pleasantly. He tried twice more to find a sentence that worked and failed both times, and eventually wandered back into the crowd to find someone easier to talk to. Margaret appeared at her side. She had the expression she wore when she was most satisfied. A carefully controlled lack of expression that communicated satisfaction precisely because it was controlled. Charles Addison, she said quietly. Edward knew him, years ago. I took a chance and wrote him a letter. Hannah looked at her. You wrote Addison? Last week, when Samuel went to Helena. I thought, if a man knew something and had been carrying it for 5 years, maybe he only needed someone to ask him to put it down. She paused. I wasn't certain he'd come. You weren't certain. You bought 80 horses with your last $33. We all have our uncertainties. The meeting took another 2 hours. Brooks spoke about next steps: formal requests for federal investigation, documentation preservation, notification to the state land office. Henry Keene provided a formal statement about the survey findings on the Carter property. Robert Henry stood and said that his family had been driving to the Carter Spring for 10 days, and that the water was clean and sufficient, and that Hannah Carter had never asked him for a penny. Ellen Caldwell stood and said that a lawyer had come to her house and tried to frighten her, and she didn't appreciate it. A woman in the back, whose name Hannah didn't know, stood and said simply that she'd heard enough, and she trusted Hannah Carter, and was there a list she could sign. There was a list. Brooks had prepared one. Noah took it around the room. The Redstone Valley Water Cooperative was proposed, formally, by Brooks. A legal structure that would give every member family a voice in management, fix access rates below current market cost, and protect the spring against individual sale or transfer. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. When it was over and the room began to empty, Hannah sat for a moment on the bench and let herself be still. The noise moved around her, and then through her, and then away from her as people filed out, and gradually the room quieted to a few remaining conversations, and then to something approaching silence. She looked at the front of the room where Hale had stood 2 hours ago, assembling his careful argument, certain of his outcome. She thought about the moment he had walked out the door. She thought about Thomas, about the mortgage letter shoved under the papers so he wouldn't worry, about 8 months of fighting to stay on land he loved, without knowing that the man circling the property had known all along what was beneath it. She felt the grief of that, clean and specific, not the general weight she'd been carrying for 6 weeks, but something more precise, the grief of understanding now the full shape of what had been done. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as she was going to feel it in public, which was about 30 seconds. Then she stood up. Noah was waiting near the door with her case and her coat. He handed her the coat without being asked, which was very like him. "The cooperative passed," he said. "I know. I was here." "I meant—" He stopped. "I mean it worked." She looked at him. He was 12 years old, and his new boots fit properly, and he had stood in the back of a room full of adults for 2 hours, with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was happening mattered. And he was looking at her now with the open, clear expression of someone who hasn't yet learned to keep his feelings entirely contained, which was one of the things about him she most valued. "It worked," she agreed. "The first part of it. What's the second part?" "The legal part, the investigation, the federal review of what Hale did." She picked up her case. "That's going to take longer, and it's going to be harder in some ways. Today was a room full of people. What comes next is paperwork and lawyers and months of patience. Can we win that too?" She thought about the envelope in Addison's pocket. She thought about Brooks's documents spread across her kitchen table. She thought about Keene's signed survey, about the water rights filing dated October 18th. "Yes," she said. "I believe we can." They walked out together into the cold October afternoon. The street outside the town hall was still busy with people from the meeting, small clusters of conversation breaking and reforming, the particular social energy of a community that has collectively learned something and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. Jacob Miller was waiting on the sidewalk. He had his wife with him, and his 3 children, including the red-haired daughter who waved at Hannah from the back of wagons. He was holding his hat in his hands, which with Jacob Miller was a significant gesture. "Mrs. Carter," he said. He looked at her directly, which took something, she could tell. "I said some things at that auction that I've been thinking about since. I called you." He stopped. His children were watching. He chose the version that worked in front of children. "I said some things I'm not proud of, and I want you to know that if you need anything, labor, materials, anything for the cooperative or the spring, you name it, and I'll be there." Hannah looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "And I'll hold you to it, Jacob." The use of his first name did something to his expression. His wife smiled. The red-haired daughter tugged on Hannah's coat sleeve. Hannah looked down. "Are the black horses really magic?" the girl asked. "Clara," her mother said. "She can ask," Hannah said. She crouched down to the girl's level. "They're not magic," she said. "They're just smarter than the people who gave up on them, which is the next best thing." Clara considered this with the serious authority of an 8-year-old processing important information. "I want to see them," she said. "Come to the ranch on Saturday," Hannah said. "Bring your family. I'll show you the whole herd." She stood up. The Millers said their goodbyes. Hannah watched them go down the street, the red-haired girl walking between her parents, turning once to look back and wave. Brooks appeared at Hannah's elbow. "We need to talk about timing on the federal inquiry," he said, in the tone that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. Bring everything." "The Addison envelope is extraordinary," he said. "If the handwriting can be matched to anyone in Hale's correspondence." "Tomorrow, Samuel." He caught himself, nodded. "Tomorrow." I went to find his stage connection. Hannah looked at Margaret, who had appeared beside her with the quiet efficiency she always showed when appearing exactly where she was needed. "You wrote Addison," Hannah said again. "I did." "Without telling me." "You had enough to think about." Margaret adjusted her gloves with the brisk composure of a woman who has done something bold and is perfectly comfortable with it. "Edward would have been pleased. He would have been insufferably pleased," Hannah said. "He would have talked about animals knowing things for a month." 2 months, Margaret said. "At least." They walked back toward the horses. Noah fell in beside Hannah and matched her pace, and the 3 of them moved down the cold street together through the remains of the afternoon, through the scattered conversations and the lingering energy of a room that had been changed. Hannah was thinking about the cooperative, about what it would take to properly develop the spring for wider distribution, about the legal work ahead, which would be significant, about the winter coming and 80 horses to feed and 43 acres of cracked clay that had already begun, quietly, to change. She was thinking about all of those things, and underneath all of them, running like the current beneath stone, she was thinking about Victor Hale's face in that last moment before he walked out the door. He had looked at her with that expression she had no name for, and she had held his gaze without flinching. And what she had felt in that moment, what she felt now, walking out into the cold, clear afternoon with Margaret on one side and Noah on the other, and the memory of 70 people voting their trust, was not triumph. Triumph was too light a word for it, too clean. It was something heavier and more honest than triumph. It was the feeling of having stood between something worth protecting and the thing trying to take it, and not having moved. Thomas would have understood that feeling. He had lived inside it for years. She thought that clearly, without the particular pain that had accompanied most thoughts of Thomas for the past 6 weeks. She thought it, and she held it for a moment, and it was its own kind of grief and its own kind of comfort at the same time. She walked home to her horses. She walked home to the sound of water pressing upward through ancient stone, finding its way through the dark, patient and certain and full of more life than the surface had any reason to suggest. Thursday was done. There was still so much left to do. The federal investigation began on a Tuesday. 2 men arrived from Helena in a government wagon with leather document cases, and the particular expression of federal officials who have been sent somewhere they didn't expect to go and are reserving judgment about what they'll find when they get there. Brooks met them at the county clerk's office and spent the morning walking them through the documentation, the survey access records, the Addison letter, the timeline of acquisitions, Keene's geological findings. Hannah was not at the clerk's office. She was at the ranch because the horses needed feeding, and the cooperative's first distribution meeting was that afternoon, and she had learned, in the past 6 weeks, that the work did not pause for the drama. Noah brought her the news when he rode back from town at noon. "They took the documents," he said, coming into the barn where she was working on the bay mare's hoof again. A recurring stone, same foot, same habit of standing on uneven ground. All of them. Brooks said they were thorough. He said one of them asked very specific questions about the timing. "Good," she said, without looking up from the hoof. Brooks also said Hale's attorneys filed a counter-challenge to the cooperative structure this morning. Something about the legal framework not meeting state requirements for water authority designation. She set the mare's hoof down and straightened up. Is he right about the requirements? Brooks said no. He said it's a delay tactic, and he can answer it in writing within the week. Then we answer it within the week. She wiped her hands on her work cloth. What time is it? 11:15. Go eat something. Cooperative meeting is at 1. The Redstone Valley Water Cooperative held its first formal meeting that afternoon in Jacob Miller's barn, which was larger than Hannah's and more centrally located for the families involved. 12 families sent representatives. Brooks had prepared a simple governing document: membership rights, access schedules, rate structure, dispute process. And he walked through it, section by section, with the patience of a man who understood that people needed to understand what they were signing before they would sign it with conviction. There were questions. Good questions. The kind that came from people who were taking the document seriously rather than performing the appearance of taking it seriously. Robert Henry asked about what happened to the rate structure if the cooperative needed capital improvements. Ellen Caldwell asked about decision-making process when families disagreed. A man named Gus Proctor asked the most direct question of the afternoon. What happens if Hale wins his legal challenge and this whole thing falls apart? The room went quiet. In the way rooms go quiet, when the question everyone has been not quite asking gets asked out loud. Hannah looked at Gus Proctor. The water rights are legally registered and documented, she said. The spring is on my property and has been formally surveyed. Even if Hale challenges the cooperative structure successfully, the underlying water rights don't change. We adjust the structure. We don't lose the water. You're certain of that? Samuel. Brooks stepped forward. The water rights claim is the foundation, he said. The cooperative is the structure built on top of it. Challenges to the structure don't undermine the foundation. What we would lose in a worst-case scenario is the specific governing framework, which we would then rebuild. The water stays. Proctor looked at Hannah. She held his gaze steadily. He nodded. All right, he said. I'm in. 11 other families signed that afternoon. Hannah signed last, in the space designated for the founding member, and when she set the pen down, she looked at her name on the document and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the morning she'd bought 80 horses with her last $33. She felt, quietly and completely, that something was going to be all right. Not everything. Not yet. The legal work was ahead of her, and the winter, and the ongoing reality of 43 acres that was still more problem than solution in most practical respects. But this specific thing, this room full of people with their names on a piece of paper that said they were going to face what was coming together instead of separately, this was something. She rode home in the late afternoon light, and she went to the East Flats, and she stood above the spring for a while. The well had been properly developed now. Keene had supervised the installation of a simple pump mechanism 2 weeks after the town meeting, and the water that had been pressing upward through cracked stone for centuries came up clean and cold and abundant, exactly as the pressure mapping had suggested it would. A wooden trough ran east from the pump head, and the horses had claimed it as their own, which Hannah had decided was only fair. The old stallion was there when she arrived. He was always there in the late afternoon, standing at the east end of the trough, drinking slowly, unhurried, with the particular quality of an animal who has accomplished what he set out to accomplish and is taking his time about the rest. Hannah leaned on the fence rail and watched him. He had put on weight in the 6 weeks since she'd brought the herd home. They all had, some more dramatically than others, the younger horses filling out faster, the old cavalry horses more slowly, their bodies rebuilding what years of hard use had taken from them, with the careful deliberateness of old things being repaired. The Mustangs were the most transformed. They had gone from wild-eyed and frantic to something that still had their fire, but had learned to direct it. And 3 of the young ones had become, under Noah's patient daily work, the beginnings of something a horseman would look at and see value in. The stallion lifted his head from the trough and looked at Hannah. She looked back. "Thank you," she said quietly. It was the first time she had said it out loud, and she felt slightly foolish saying it, and she said it anyway because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it. He held her gaze for a moment, dark and steady and entirely himself. Then he went back to drinking. She stayed there until the light was gone. Victor Hale left Redstone Valley on a Thursday, exactly 5 weeks after the town meeting, in a private carriage with 3 trunks and his 2 attorneys, and no ceremony whatsoever. Hannah heard about it from Margaret, who had heard it from Aldous Price at the county clerk's office, who had processed the paperwork transferring Hale's 4 Valley properties to a holding company with a Helena address that Samuel Brooks identified as a vehicle for managed asset liquidation. He hadn't sold the properties. He'd put them in a legal container designed to keep the federal investigation at arm's length, while his attorneys worked the problem from a distance. Brooks had expected something like this. It was the move of a man who was not surrendering so much as executing a strategic withdrawal to more defensible ground. "He'll be back," Brooks told her, when she sat across from him at her kitchen table the morning after. "I know. Not in person, through lawyers. The federal inquiry is going to take time. These things always do. And there's a period of vulnerability between now and when the findings are formalized, where he'll try to negotiate a settlement that minimizes his exposure." What does that mean for the cooperative? Nothing in the short term. The cooperative is legally separate from the federal question. Your water rights are registered. His departure doesn't change your position. If anything, it strengthens it, because the practical pressure on you goes down while the legal process runs. Hannah looked at him. "What do you need from me?" "Patience," he said, "and documentation. Keep records of everything related to the cooperative, every meeting, every vote, every access request. We are building a record that Hale's attorneys will eventually have to negotiate against, and the cleaner and more complete that record is, the stronger our position." "I can do that." "I know you can," he said. "That's why I'm not worried about it." He left for Helena 2 days later, with a promise to return when the federal inquiry produced preliminary findings, and a standing arrangement to receive any legal correspondence on Hannah's behalf. Margaret drove him to the stage stop, which was 3 miles farther than she needed to go, which Hannah chose not to comment on. December came in cold and fast, the way December always did in Montana. Not gradually, but decisively. The temperature dropping in a single week from uncomfortable to brutal, the sky going from gray to the particular flat white of serious winter. Hannah had been preparing for it since October, buying hay in small amounts whenever she could scrape together the cash, trading labor with Jacob Miller for additional feed, accepting contributions from cooperative families who had decided that the horses were, in some practical and some symbolic sense, communal property. She hadn't asked for the contributions. They came anyway. Robert Henry brought 2 bales of hay in his wagon and unloaded them without fanfare and drank a cup of coffee at her kitchen table and said that his wife sent her regards. The Caldwells brought a barrel of grain. Gus Proctor showed up one Saturday morning with his 2 oldest sons and 3 fence posts and repaired the southwest section that the young Mustang had been testing since arrival. He didn't announce he was coming. He just came and did the work and left. And when Hannah tried to thank him, he waved her off with the gruff practicality of a man who finds gratitude more embarrassing than labor. She let him be gruff about it. She understood the language. Noah thrived in December in a way that she wouldn't have predicted, and then, watching it, found she should have predicted entirely. He was up before her every morning, managing the feeding rotation he had designed himself. A systematic schedule that ensured every horse got sufficient intake without waste, which was harder to maintain with 80 animals than it sounded, and which he had worked out with the focused problem-solving of a boy who had found the thing he was good at and was not going to be modest about it. He had named all 80 horses, which she had told him was impractical, and had privately given up discouraging because the names were good and the horses responded to them. The stallion he called Solomon. She had not expected that, and when he told her, she had looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Solomon," she said finally. "He's wise," Noah said simply, "and old, and he led everyone to the right place. It seemed right." She thought about it. "It is right," she said. He beamed, which was rare for him, and immediately composed his face back into its careful maturity, which made her want to smile in a way she kept to herself. Solomon, yes, that was right. The mare who had the recurring stone. Hannah had started calling her Patience, for reasons that were self-explanatory. Foaled in February, which was earlier than Hannah had calculated, and which produced a frantic night in the barn, with Noah holding a lantern and talking to Patience in his steady voice while Hannah worked, and which resulted in a foal that was coal-black and entirely healthy, and which stood on its legs within an hour, with the determined wobbliness of something that has decided it is going to manage and is simply working out the mechanics. Noah named him first, because he was. "First what?" Hannah said. "First of many," he said. "We're going to have a lot more." He was not wrong. By spring, 4 more mares had foaled. By summer, the herd had grown to 89, and 2 of the Mustang mares were showing signs that would put the number higher before autumn. Margaret came to see the foals in March. She stood at the fence on a morning that had the first real warmth of approaching spring in it, and she watched. First trot in erratic circles around his mother, while Solomon stood nearby and observed the performance with dignified tolerance, and she was quiet for a long while. "Edward would have stayed all day," she said. "You've been here 2 hours," Hannah pointed out. "I'm not Edward." She was quiet again for a moment. "How are you, Hannah? Really?" It was the question Margaret asked perhaps once a month, and she always said really in that particular way, not as an intensifier, but as a direction, pointing at the thing beneath the answer Hannah would give otherwise. Hannah thought about it honestly. The winter had been hard. The legal work had been exhausting and slow-moving, and had required a particular kind of sustained patience that was different from the dramatic patience of crisis. It was the unglamorous patience of reading documents and writing responses and waiting for processes that moved at their own speed, regardless of what she needed. The cooperative had hit 3 significant disagreements in its first 3 months of operation, 2 of which had been resolved cleanly, and 1 of which had required 3 separate meetings and a compromise that left no one entirely satisfied, which Brooks had told her was the sign of a functioning democratic structure, and which had felt considerably less theoretical in the room where it was happening. She was tired. She was more tired than she had been at any point in the fall, because the fall had had the adrenaline of crisis to sustain her, and the winter had required her to sustain herself on something quieter and less dramatic. But she was all right. "I'm all right," she said, and she meant it in the specific sense that Margaret would understand. Not all right as in everything is fine, but all right as in standing, functional, continuing. Margaret looked at her. "You look better than all right." "Don't push it, Margaret." "I never push," Margaret said serenely. "I observe." The federal investigation produced its preliminary findings in April. Brooks arrived from Helena with the document on a Wednesday afternoon and sat across from Hannah at the kitchen table and walked her through it with the careful precision of a man who understood that what he was about to communicate had been a long time coming and deserved to be communicated properly. The findings were significant. The federal inquiry had confirmed that an agent of the Hale Land Acquisition Company had accessed the valley's geological survey data 6 weeks before Hale began purchasing local properties. It had further confirmed that Hale's representation to 3 of the 4 families involved in subsequent sales, the Collins, Henderson, and Wheeler transactions, had included statements about the land's long-term water viability that were, in the language of the document, materially inconsistent with information available to the buyer at the time of sale. Materially inconsistent. Legal language for lie. Brooks read her the relevant section twice. She sat with her hands on the table and her coffee getting cold, and she listened both times all the way through. When he finished the second reading, she said, "What happens now? The families have grounds to pursue civil action for damages. That's a separate process from the federal inquiry, but the preliminary findings significantly strengthen any such action." He set the document down. "And Hale's attorneys reached out to my office this morning. He wants to negotiate." The kitchen was quiet. "Tell me what that means," she said. "It means he's calculated that the civil liability exposure from 3 fraudulent land transactions, combined with the federal inquiry findings and the public record that has now been established in this county, represents a greater cost than whatever he would gain by continuing to fight. He wants to settle." "What's he offering?" Brooks told her. She sat with the number for a moment. It was not a small number, It was the kind of number that would clear the mortgage on the Carter Ranch completely, fund the cooperative's infrastructure development for 3 years, and provide meaningful compensation to the Collins, Henderson, and Wheeler families for what they had lost. "Is it enough?" she asked. "For the families? No amount is entirely enough, but it's considerably more than they would likely recover through protracted litigation, and litigation would take years." He paused. "The decision isn't mine, or yours alone. The 3 families would need to agree." "Would you recommend they accept?" He looked at her steadily. "I would tell them what I've just told you, what they stand to gain and what the alternative looks like, and let them decide. That's the right answer, even if it's not the satisfying one." "Then that's what we do." The 3 families came to the Carter Ranch on a Saturday in late April. Hannah served coffee and Margaret served the beef stew she brought for every serious occasion, and Brooks laid out the settlement offer and the alternatives with the same careful clarity he'd used at every stage of this, and the 3 families sat around Hannah's kitchen table and had the kind of conversation that can only happen between people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side of it still talking. It took 4 hours. In the end, they accepted. Not easily, not without pain. The Henderson patriarch cried, briefly and without apology, and no one pretended not to notice. But they accepted, with the particular resolution of people who have been fighting long enough to recognize when a fight has arrived somewhere worth stopping. Victor Hale's name was not on the settlement agreement. His company's name was. Hannah noted this and understood it as the last kind of vanity, the kind that outlasts everything else, the need to keep one's name off the papers that document what one has done. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday in May. Brooks filed the paperwork. The cooperative received its infrastructure funding. The mortgage on the Carter Ranch was paid in full. Hannah rode to the bank the day the payment cleared. She sat across from Nathan Holt, who had the expression of a man who was genuinely pleased by an outcome he had not expected, and she accepted the canceled mortgage note from his hands, and she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to the original bill of sale for 80 black horses that she had carried since October. "Congratulations, Mrs. Carter," Holt said, with what appeared to be sincere feeling. "Thank you, Mr. Holt. I confess I had my doubts, when you came in October, about the horses." Everyone had their doubts. "You didn't," he said. She thought about the 10 seconds of raw terror she had allowed herself standing at the holding yard gate. She thought about the nights at the kitchen table with her journal open and the numbers saying impossible, and herself sitting across from them and refusing to believe that. "I had plenty of doubts," she said. "I just didn't let them vote." He smiled. She stood, shook his hand, and left. Summer came to Redstone Valley, the way it came after a long drought year. Carefully, as if testing whether it was welcome. The grass on the Carter Ranch came in slowly, and then all at once, driven by the cooperative's irrigation channels that now ran along the eastern border of 4 adjacent properties. Hannah watched the green come in from her porch and felt Thomas everywhere in it. In the fence posts he had set, in the particular angle of the barn roof he had spent a winter straightening, in the creak of the porch board that she kept meaning to fix, because the sound of it was familiar in a way that felt like company. She talked to him sometimes. Not often, but sometimes in the evenings, when the light was going and the horses were settling and Noah was inside and the ranch was quiet. She would sit on the porch and talk, and she did not feel foolish about it. She felt that a man who had loved a piece of land the way Thomas had loved this one probably had some continuing interest in knowing how it was going. She told him about Solomon. She told him about First, who was turning out to be fast, impractically, joyfully fast, the kind of horse that made you want to just stand and watch him run. She told him about the cooperative and the 3 families and the settlement and the mortgage. She told him about Brooks and Margaret and Reverend Pierce's 2-month sermon series about justice and community that had become something of a local institution. She told him about Noah. She told him a lot about Noah. The adoption was finalized in July, in a judge's office in Helena, with Margaret as witness, and Brooks handling the paperwork, and Noah wearing a new shirt that he had buttoned correctly for the occasion. The judge was a small, precise woman who read through the documents with the efficiency of someone who processed a great many of these, and then looked up and looked at Noah and looked at Hannah and said, "Is this what you both want?" Noah looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Noah. "Yes," they said, in the same moment, which made the judge's precise expression do something that was almost a smile. On the stage back from Helena, Noah sat across from Hannah and looked out the window at the passing country and was quiet for a long time, in the way he was quiet when something had moved him and he was deciding how to carry it. Finally he said, "Does this mean I have to stop calling you Mrs. Carter?" "What would you like to call me?" He thought about it seriously. "Can I think about it?" "Take your time." He looked back out the window. 3 miles of passing country. "Hannah," he said finally, testing it. She looked at him. "Is that all right?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the morning he had appeared at her elbow in the holding yard with his coat buttoned wrong, watching 80 starving horses with the expression of someone who has just found a cause. She thought about him sitting beside her on the cracked clay of the East Flats after they found the spring, shoulder almost touching hers. She thought about the lantern he held on Patience's foaling night, and the way he talked to every horse by name, and Solomon, and First, and the fence he had repaired, and the water he had hauled, and the 4 months of being 12 years old in the middle of something that would have broken most adults. "Hannah," she said. "Yes, that's all right." He nodded once, with great composure, and looked back out the window. She looked out her own window and let the country pass, and she let herself feel the full weight and the full warmth of the afternoon, the particular quality of a day that has given you something you did not know, until you had it, how much you had needed. The valley was a different place by autumn, not unrecognizable. It was still hard country, still demanded more than it offered on most days, still produced the specific character that only land with teeth creates in the people who choose to stay on it. But the drought had eased, because the cooperative's irrigation network was working, and 3 additional springs had been identified through the summer by families who had taken Hannah's story to heart, and started, tentatively, to pay attention to where their animals moved. Not all of the attempts had found water. But 2 had, and what those 2 finds meant for the families involved was the difference between leaving and staying. People started saying the valley was coming back. Hannah heard this from enough different mouths that she began to believe it was true, in the way that things are true when enough people who have no reason to be optimistic become optimistic anyway. Solomon's herd, she had started calling it that, and Noah had approved enthusiastically, continued to grow. By October, 4 months after First's birth, there were 93 horses on the Carter Ranch. 3 of the young Mustangs had been sold to neighboring ranchers as working stock, bringing in income that Hannah had put directly back into hay and fence repair, and the quality of the animals was becoming known. A rancher from 2 valleys over had ridden out specifically to look at the herd and had spent 2 hours with Noah discussing bloodlines, and when he left, he had made an offer on 2 of the young stallions that Hannah had accepted without counter-offering, because it was a fair price from a man who knew horses, and that was worth more than squeezing an extra $10. Word traveled. It always traveled. There were visitors now, occasionally. People who had heard the story from someone who had heard it from someone else, coming to see the ranch and the spring and the horses. Hannah did not encourage this, but she did not discourage it either, because the story that traveled was always roughly true. A widow and a boy, and 80 dying horses, and a spring no one had found. And roughly true was the best you could reasonably ask of any story passed through human hands more than twice. Clara Miller came on her 9th birthday specifically to see the horses, as Hannah had promised, and she stood at the east fence for 40 minutes, watching the herd move and asking Noah questions at a pace that impressed Hannah with its density and persistence. Noah answered every one of them seriously because he was constitutionally incapable of being condescending about horses. And Clara went home with the expression of someone who has decided something important about the direction of her life. Her mother caught Hannah's eye on the way out and raised her eyebrows. Hannah raised hers back. Some decisions made in childhood didn't survive contact with time, and some of them were the decisions that organized everything that came after. There was no way to know which this was. But the look on Clara Miller's face watching Solomon move across the East Flats was the look of something specific and settled. And Hannah had learned enough about that expression to respect it. One evening in late October, the first anniversary, more or less, of the morning she had driven the last nail into Thomas's coffin, and looked out at 43 acres of cracked clay and made herself a promise. Hannah walked out to the East Flats at sunset and sat on the ground near the spring. Solomon was there. He was always there. She sat with her back against the fence post, and her knees pulled up, and she looked at the herd spread across the land. 93 horses moving in the last of the evening light, black against the brown gold of the autumn grass, their breath visible in the cooling air, their hooves steady on ground that had given up its secret and had not been the same since. She thought about everything the year had held. She thought about the things she had lost, and the things she had not lost, and the difference between them. She thought about the work that remained. The cooperative's second year, the legal record still being built, the federal findings still working their way through their process, the endless practical business of keeping a ranch alive through another Montana winter. She thought about Noah inside the house right now, almost certainly naming something he shouldn't be naming. And she felt the particular warmth of that thought in her chest, like a coal kept carefully from going cold. She thought about the moment she had stood at the holding yard gate and seen 80 starving horses and said, "I'll take them." She thought about Thomas saying, "You are the steadiest person I have ever known," which he had said once, on a night when the ranch was in trouble, and she had been frightened and hadn't been able to hide it as well as she wanted to, and which she had remembered every day since, in the way you remember things that become load-bearing. She thought about all of it, and she let it be everything it was. The grief and the determination and the exhaustion and the grace of it, without trying to make it simpler or cleaner than the truth. Solomon walked slowly toward her across the flats. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her with those dark, ancient eyes that had looked at her the first time in the holding yard and decided something. "We did all right," she said to him. He held her gaze in that way he had, steady, unhurried, entirely certain of himself and of her. She reached out and put her hand flat against the side of his jaw, and he let her, and they stayed like that for a moment in the last of the October light, while the herd moved around them and the water ran cold and clean from the pump head into the trough, and the grass that had been dead earth a year ago rustled in the evening wind. The valley was alive, not because one woman had become extraordinary. She had not become extraordinary. She had become exactly who she had always been, only more so, under pressure that had burned away everything that wasn't essential. She had been steady when steadiness was the hardest thing. She had trusted what she saw when everyone around her was telling her she was wrong. She had opened her hands when a lesser person would have closed them, and what she had opened them toward had turned out to be the thing that saved not only herself, but every family in the valley who had been dying of thirst on land that held water they hadn't known how to find. That was the truth of it. Not a miracle, not magic. The specific, unglamorous, difficult truth that compassion had a practical weight, that trust had consequences worth living through, that the things everyone had given up on were sometimes the things that had the most left to give. If someone would only stop long enough to follow them to the place they were already trying to go. Solomon lifted his head and looked east, the way he always had, the way he always would. Hannah looked east with him. The spring was there. The water was there. The valley stretched out beyond the fence line in the fading light, full of families who were going to make it through the winter, full of the particular stubborn life of people who had decided, in the end, not to be defeated by the thing trying to defeat them. She had not found the valley's future. The horses had found it long before she arrived. She had only been wise enough, and desperate enough, and stubborn enough, and steady enough to follow them. And that, in the end, was everything.